All right, hello everyone. I'm going to be debating theism with Nathan Bozeman, host of a radio show. Um, and we may talk a bit about resurrection stuff. We'll see.
Hmm.
So um, I can go first in terms of I mean a primary reason why I'm an atheist is because of the problem of evil. I think it's hard
Okay.
to well, actually, I think it's impossible to provide an account of why, if there was a perfect God, thousands of children die every day. Instances of evil that seem clearly gratuitous, and I think all the theodicies fail spectacularly. Um, so, what do you think about the problem of evil?
So you kind of broke up in the middle of your explanation. All the last thing I heard was you think it's impossible for a perfectly good being to account for this, and then you cut out. So could you repeat whatever you said after that?
Yeah, I think that there are lots of instances of gratuitous evil that
Okay.
can't be accounted for by any of the theodicies successfully, and that are incompatible with a perfect God. So, if there were a God, you would expect the world to be optimally designed. You would expect it not to have diseases that kill tens of thousands of children under the age of 5 every day. You'd expect there not to be infants trapped by suffocating under buildings by earthquakes.
Hmm.
I mean, just to give one example, being burned to death is no doubt a extremely horrendous and painful experience.
Hmm.
It just seems so clear that if being burned to death was 5% less painful, let's say, then that wouldn't jeopardize any great goods. There just seem like tens of thousands of examples of ways of improving the world which we would expect to exist if there were a perfect God.
Sure.
So
I mean, I agree with everything you just said. I think that the problem of evil is probably the most difficult problem to deal with as a theist. I think that uh, I like the way Augustine tries to handle it, but I also like hear what you're saying. A lot of what you're talking about is natural evil, as opposed to moral evil. So, like if we were to maybe make a distinction between those two, which one would you want to tackle first? Is either one of those a problem for you, or is it mostly the natural evil?
well, I think that they're both a problem, but I think that the problem is more clear in the case of natural evil. So let's discuss natural evil.
Okay, so yeah, I would agree. I think I could easily just appeal to free will for the moral evil, even though you might say like, well, why doesn't God stop it? But we can go to natural evil. So, I mean, I agree. I think that this is a problem for theism. That if we were to do like a prior probability argument, I think that this would lean towards the atheist view. So I'm willing to give you that. I don't think it's so in your field that theists can't, make it back to being the correct view. However, I think that if we were to start, like, let's say that it was in the middle before this conversation started, it's like slightly in your favor. And then I think, and I believe that whenever you take into account all of the arguments for theism, that it kind of tilts back in my favor. And then when we take all the evidence together, that it ends up being theism is the more robust view of the world, and I think it better explains our experiences.
Yeah, so you said that you think it only sort of would slightly push our credence. Well, I think that dramatically understates the force of the argument. I mean, we have quite literally thousands or tens of thousands of phenomena that we have no hope of explaining. Now, this,
Mm-hmm.
it is in general a problem if there are thousands of phenomena that a theory can't explain, namely the
Mm-hmm.
thousands of disparate instances of natural evil. And yet, the problem is much bigger in the case of theism, because not only do we have all these things that can't explain it, we've had some of history's greatest minds for thousands of years being attempting to come up with justifications. And the problem of coming up, the problem of generating a successful theodicy has been, in my view, an utter failure that has for and so it would be as if in terms of trying to respond to the fine tuning argument,
Mm-hmm.
we had the greatest minds thousands of years focus on trying to solve the fine tuning argument after we already had the relevant scientific knowledge in place. And they all drew it blank. There was no alternative explanation like the multiverse, nothing like that.
Mm-hmm.
And we had hundreds or thousands of different instances of allegedly finely tuned parameters. That seems to be how dire the situation is for the theist when it comes to the problem of evil. So it's not just something that would move our credence from 50% to 60%. It's something that would move our credence from 50% to near zero.
I mean, I guess I would just disagree with you there because whenever we take into account the fact that the burden of proof for that is so high that we would have to say that there's no possible explanation where God could bring goodness out of it. And I feel like that's a burden of proof that can't be reached. Like if we were to say that that yes, some forms of suffering seem a little bit extreme, or obviously way too extreme, maybe in your view, but your burden of proof would have to say that there is no world, there's no possible way that God couldn't bring good out of it. And I just don't think that's something that can be proven.
Well,
And I
so
think that a lot of philosophers have abandoned the problem of evil today because of that burden of proof. I think that, to my understanding, a lot of people don't think that the problem of evil works anymore. And I know that some people do, but I just know that from what I've heard and from what I've read, a lot of people have kind of abandoned this issue because of what I just put forward, that the burden of proof, I think, is really high for you guys.
Well, virtually. So, I mean, people have abandoned the logical problem of evil, but I'm not aware of there being a mass exodus from making evidential problems of evil. They seem to be the thing that the strongest piece of evidence that's most frequently touted as evidence for theism. But your claim that the atheist has to provide a justification for how there couldn't be an explanation. Well, so I mean, one point that's worth making is consider like Newtonian mechanics, Newtonian theorem, the Newtonian theorem of physics. Well, the reason why we no longer believe it is because there were lots of phenomena that it was not able to adequately explain. Yet it would always be possible to say maybe there's going to be some explanation out there, but we don't know what it is. However, if you had a similar evidential scenario with Newtonian physics, we rejected it for much less than we rejected the problem of evil. So with Newtonian physics, it would always be possible to postulate an extra mechanism. But if the world's greatest minds had been trying to come up with an extra mechanism to save Newtonian physics, and in terms of explaining the data, and had failed for thousands of years after we had all the relevant experimental evidence come in, and then we're merely holding out hope that there would be some explanation that would be out there, even though we had no idea what form it would take, despite the existence of literally tens of thousands of counterexamples, then that would be a decisive reason to reject Newtonian physics. Indeed, we currently reject Newtonian physics for far less. We currently reject Newtonian physics because there are just a bunch of things that it can't explain, but far fewer than the instances of evil that exist in the world. But I think that there are lots of challenges, lots of sort of significant hurdles for there being a successful theodicy at all. So one of them is that there are tens of thousands of instances of evil in the world, and if even one of them is gratuitous, that would mean that God doesn't exist, because that would mean that there are some phenomena that are incompatible with the existence of God, because God wouldn't make things for which the world would be worse for them having existed. And yet, not only is it the case that the theist has to hold that the world is better from the outset for malaria, flesh-eating parasites, the sheer amount of pain of torture, and of people being burned alive being precisely what it is. Also, trivial annoyances that don't seem to contribute to any great world, and the billions of years of suffering of animals that's been going on since before the time of the dinosaurs. They have to hold that every ounce of suffering experienced by every dinosaur and the millions of years before that every single ounce of those serves some greater purpose. But remember, God's omnipotent, so God can do whatever he wants. He can actualize any metaphysically possible state of affairs. And so they have to hold not only are all of those sufferings such that the world would be worse in their absence, but that an omnipotent God can't figure out any other way of achieving that. And so, and if this were, last point I make on this before I hand it back to you, sorry, I've been going on for a bit. But,
no worries, bro. I'm trying to keep track of everything you've said, but I'm going.
Yeah, but if this really were truly the case, that every single evil had some morally sufficient reason for it, you would expect us to discover some of the morally sufficient reasons for evil. And yet I don't think that the project of figuring out a morally sufficient reason for evil, it's not just that we've only figured out the reasons for 80% of evil. We have no idea for nearly all the instances of evil in the world. So overall, I think that it's just a completely damning piece of evidence if you don't have a successful theodicy, and I think all the theodicies fail.
Okay, so you made a ton of claims there, so I kind of have to take, I guess, one at a time from what I can remember. So I think the first one is to say, you said that God can actualize any world, and if any form of suffering is gratuitous, then God doesn't exist. I think that was the first thing you said. Is that correct that you
I
said?
said metaphysically possible state of affairs. Now,
Okay.
I should have been slightly more precise. There was a slight caveat that I would add, which is, you might say that God can't, that a random coin landing heads is a metaphysically possible state of affairs, but God can't guarantee that a random coin would land of heads by virtue of being random. And so you might say something like that, but, close enough.
Okay. So, but then you said that if any bit of superfluous bit of suffering exists, then God doesn't exist. Was that a claim you made? Am I like hearing
Um,
that right, or
yeah,
would you?
more specifically, if there's any evil for which the world would have been better had it been designed to not include that evil, then God doesn't exist.
Okay. I think it's commonly held that there's no logical contradiction between that type of evil and a good God existing. It seems on its face, like surface level, to contradict God's existence, but it doesn't necessarily just say, like, okay, God clearly doesn't exist because there is gratuitous evil in the world, or there's a lot of suffering in the world. I think that if we look at the fact that, first of all, like I mentioned Augustine earlier, and he argues that evil has no ontological status. It's actually just a privation of the good. It's not actually something that has an ontological substance, so to speak. It's kind of like darkness. Like if you look up the definition of darkness, darkness is a privation of light. It's where light is not. Evil holds the same ontological status as good, or as a. If we were to make an analogy there, it's like good is the light and darkness is the evil, and so it doesn't hold an ontological status in that sense. And so when we see that evil is there, we would just say that there's a privation of good in that moment, but it doesn't necessarily hold that, or there's no logical contradiction there that, okay, now therefore God doesn't exist. Now I do agree, like you said, that there is a ton of suffering in the world, and I think that theists should take this argument seriously. I'm not in any way trying to say that like this argument is weak just because I said it like slightly tilts the things in your favor. The reason I say it that way is because I think that there is no logical contradiction with evil existing and God existing. And so that's why I would say that it's not like it, like you said, it brings the prior probability to almost zero. I think it just brings it
Well,
slightly in your favor just because I would say that it's not logical contradiction. So it's like it's surprising on theism, but it's not like 0% chance that it's true now. And
well,
that's, I
okay,
guess, where I
so
would throw it back to you.
sure. So on your final point about there being no logical contradiction, well, that's a ridiculously low bar. I mean, there's also no logical contradiction between Newtonian mechanics and the things that we've discovered in physics. But if Newtonian mechanics has predictions that straightforwardly go against what we've discovered in physics, well, then that's quite good evidence against Newtonian mechanics. I think that I do think maybe there is a successful version of the logical problem of evil, but that's not currently the argument I'm making. I'm making an evidential problem of evil. And so just how I define gratuitous suffering is suffering for which, had the world been different to not include that suffering, the world would have been better. And it seems like just an entailment of being a perfect being is that if there's a bad thing that will happen that you could prevent without jeopardizing any better thing. So if you could prevent a bad thing from happening, and in doing so make the world a better place, that you should do so. That just seems to be what a good being does. And particularly when we consider the magnitude of many of the world's evils. So, I mean, if a person could have prevented 9/11 and just chose not to, just didn't do anything to intervene, we would think them immortal. But if you look around the world at the natural evils, you have a 6 9/11s equivalent of people being killed every day purely from natural diseases and purely for children under the age of 5. And so if there was a mass slaughter of 5-year-olds that was going on that could be prevented by a being without jeopardizing any greater thing, then it would seem to be the case that getting rid of said evil would be a good thing. You said that evil is just a privation. So for one, you still have the problem of explaining why all this privation of good is happening. Because it's better for there to be good than a privation of good. So why is there all this privation of good? As Sobel pointed out. But second of all, If evil is just a privation of good, well, I think that's wildly implausible. So consider two worlds. World one has just nothing. There's no sentient beings. World two has infinite people being infinitely tortured. Which world's better? Well, I would say that the world where there's nothing is way better than the world where everyone's being infinitely tortured. And yet, neither of those have any good on the privation account. But if there's nothing bad about evil, if it's just the absence of good, then two worlds both not containing any good would just be the same in terms of how good they are. So
I guess my question there would be, how can we tell that the world with nothing is better? And I'm not asking that in the sense that, oh, of course it's better, right? I'm saying, what standard are we basing that on? Right.
well,
So
oh, sorry, good.
I was just going to say, like, if we're basing that on some sort of standard, and the standard has to be a standard of good. So if the evil world is worse, then there has to be a good that it's contradicting. There has to be a good that we're comparing it to. For example, if I were to tell you a lie right now, we know that that's bad because I could have told you the truth and I chose not to. And that's why I'm saying it's a privation of the good, because whenever we're talking about evil, we're necessarily, like, you can't have evil without good, but you can have good without evil. And that's kind of where the theist comes in, is that, like, I could have a perfectly, like, when I tell you the truth, it's just a good thing. I don't have to think about evil to talk about good and talk about truth. But when I'm talking about a lie, I'm saying there was a good there that could have taken place, but it did not. And I think,
Well,
so when we're looking at that universe example, I would say that we're having to base that on some kind of standard, which means that there's goodness there and it exists.
wait, so would you just I mean, what I would base that on is intuition. And I think that what seems to us to be the case is generally a decent guide to what is in fact the case, particularly if we have reflective seemings about the world that are principled. But I mean, would you really just reject that a world of infinite people being infinitely tortured was just as good as non-existence? Is that really a claim you would make?
No. That wasn't what I was saying. I'm saying that the reason we know that it's worse is because there's a standard that we're basing that on. And that was the claim I'm making.
Yeah, I agree that there is a standard, but I don't
Mhm.
understand why that standard entails that evil is just the absence of good. So if evil were just the absence of good, then if there were two worlds, both of which didn't have any good, it wouldn't matter how much evil they had, because evil is just what you get when you end up good. But the world with infinite torture would be way worse than the world where no one's happy or sad at all, where no one exists. Which shows that evil can't just be a privation of good.
Well, I mean, I think that I would just push back, because going back, and once again, I'm not making the claim that the one where the infinite evil is definitely worse than the universe that you're positing that has nothing existing at all, right? I think that personally that's an impossible world, because I think God is a necessary being, but we'll just neglect that for a moment. But I'm
Okay, we can just say apart from God's creation, because presumably you think God was free to not create anything else other than Him, right?
sure, but even
but
if he didn't create, he would still exist. So there would never be nothing from my view.
But would God have been free to create an empty world where there was no life?
I'm not sure, because I think when God created, he created time and space itself. And so I'm not sure how that would work, because if before the creation moment, classical theism would hold that he was in a timeless state, which means that no change happens. So he was in like a perfectly changeless state. And so from the moment of creation, now he's in time and, experiencing the world along with us. And so I would say that it's hard to say that if he made a decision, time would have had to begin. And so something, I don't know how. Yeah.
Okay. We can just, to simplify this, make it so that we're talking about what humans are creating. So let's say that humans could either create torture world or nothing world, where one of them is just this expanding a bubble of space time expanding into endless darkness with no life.
Okay.
To quote William Lane Craig, no life, just dead and dying stars expanding into endless darkness. And the second world is just pure torture.
Sure.
Presumably, the pure torture world would be worse.
Oh yeah, for sure. But
so
I
why
guess
is that true? Because presumably the first world doesn't have any good, right? And so if evil is just a privation of good, then they have the same amount. Then there's nothing that both of them have no good. and that's the only axiological standard by which the worlds are being evaluated. So why wouldn't the worlds be equal?
I see the point that you're making. I guess what I would say back to that is that in the world where nothing exists, I think that uh, it would I would just posit that that would be a metaphysically impossible world because God would exist necessarily, so there would be goodness.
Well, okay,
And then
nothing
so
aside
I would
from
just say
God exists.
from my worldview, that's a metaphysically impossible um, thing to posit. So it'd be
Okay,
like saying
nothing
so
aside from God exists.
it'd be like saying there's a world of infinite evil. I even think that's metaphysically impossible
Well,
because
okay,
God would have to exist.
sure. So we can say that both worlds have God in them because God necessarily exists, but they have nothing else. So one of the worlds just has God, and well, okay, not infinite torture if you have a problem with infinite, but a trillion people being tortured in the most brutal ways imaginable. And the second world has uh, 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 has just no life, just God hanging out. Um, Presumably, the torture world would be worse.
Oh, for sure, because in one you have perfect goodness, and then the other one you have a bunch of torture, which is a privation of the good. So that would be how I
Okay,
would. I guess I'm rejecting your analogy because I don't think it's metaphysically possible for either of those things to exist. I think
you don't
even
think that? Well, no. So remember, in this scenario, we've stipulated that God is part of the world, right?
yes,
So,
but
um,
I would still just posit that if a world, if even if God created an empty world like you're trying to say, he would still exist, and so the goodness
right.
would be there.
We
So
we
it
agree
wouldn't be
that God
nothing.
exists in those worlds, but the question is, just
Yes.
aside from God, which world would be greater?
Okay. I mean, I guess you have to go with the one that where nothing's happening because obviously torture's worse than nothing. So,
Right,
uh,
but if
yeah.
torture is worse than nothing, then torture can't just be the absence of good. Torture has to be actively bad
Hmm. Okay,
because
I
there's
see what you're
nothing good in
saying.
the other world. Yeah.
I see
Um,
what you're saying. I'm just, I feel like there's something wrong with this argument. I'm not philosophically trained enough to spot it, but I feel like I feel like there's something wrong with here. So I'm gonna just
okay.
hold to the fact that I reject that analogy because I think they're metaphysically impossible, and I can't spot another problem with it.
Okay, sure. So yeah, so we can, but so we can move on to my second objection to this, which is that even if evil is just the absence of good, you have to explain why there's all this absence of good going on. Like
Okay.
why? So if malaria is just not good thing, it's just the absence of good things. Well, God presumably wants there to be more good things.
Hmm.
So why is there malaria? So this isn't much of a theodicy. And this point is not original to me. It was raised by Sobel in logic
I
and
guess
theism.
I guess I would just posit that the Bible, because I'm a Christian, so I believe in the Bible. I just think that
Shocking.
what the Bible teaches is not that. The Bible teaches that God created a world and there was perfect goodness, and then the fall happened, and then obviously evil and sin entered into the world, and Satan and his fallen angels are down here, and we're like in his kingdom, is the way the Bible explains it. So like we're not like that's why evil isn't a contradiction to a theist, is because we believe that we live in a world where Satan and his fallen angels rule this kingdom, but there will come a time where you can come to heaven if you believe in faith. And so um in that kind of way, I just don't think that any privation of evil is any contradiction with the fact that we're in Satan's territory. And that's why I don't want to argue this from a biblical perspective, because I mean, I know you don't believe in God, but uh,
Well, no, well,
based on the
you
Christian
can.
worldview, that is how we view it. So that is what I would say.
Yeah, no, I mean, you can, of course, appeal to the ways that Christians attempt to get out of this, because we're arguing that which worldview is correct. And so, if Christianity had some successful Christianity-specific theodicy, that would be great for Christianity, but it doesn't. So, in terms of the theodicy that you raised about the fall, well, so for one, I think that it's just very obvious on any plausible account, axiological account, that the Garden of Eden was not the best possible world. like, I mean, it seems like if we accept the very modest principle that if you have any two worlds and one world has higher average utility, total utility, and more equal distribution of utility than another world, then it's better with respect to utility. Then that would mean that the Garden of Eden was not the best possible world. But even if we grant the Garden of Eden was the best possible world, so the way that the Garden of Eden got nuked was because Adam and Eve ate from the tree of the fruit of knowledge of good and evil. But there's no like logical entailment between eating fruit from that tree and bringing evil into the world, and particularly and bringing the specific state of evil. So you could imagine eating from the tree not resulting in malaria, flesh-eating parasites, the agony of being burned alive, all being brought into the world. And so you still have to explain why God made the unfortunate side effect of eating that fruit involve tens of thousands of children dying from preventable diseases every year.
Well, I would just say that in the fall moment, he told Eve that now you're going to have pain when you bear children, and you're going to have to work the land. It's not, the food isn't just going to be there for you and provided for you. Now you're going to have to work for it. And so I think at the moment of the fall, God pretty explicitly says, hey, there's going to be suffering now. There's going to be a lot of hard work ahead of you. You're not going to be able to live in a good world. And I think that that's not in any contradiction with Christianity. And that's why I am a Christian, is because I think it best explains the world we live in. I think that there is evil, and God explicitly said that in the fall moment. There's suffering. God said that Eve would suffer in childbirth, and there would be more suffering beyond that. That I just don't, I understand, like I said, I don't take the problem of evil lightly. I understand there's evil in the world. I think there's way more than there should be. But at the same time, like I said, because there's no contradiction, because I like Augustine's thing, and I know we talked about the ontological status thing, but just it being the privation of the good, I would still hold that, due to your analogy positing metaphysically impossible worlds. I would still hold that works, but I just think that Christianity still is a fine worldview given evil, and I don't think it is a defeater for Christianity.
Yeah, so I think I addressed successfully your objection to about the metaphysical impossibility stuff, and I guess that'll be in the eyes of the viewer.
They can debate that in the comments. Maybe I'm misunderstanding it still, but I would just posit those are metaphysically impossible worlds, and
sure.
Therefore, it doesn't work.
But in terms of your point, so you said that the reason there's evil, so is because of the fall and eating from the fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. That's such a mouthful every time.
It's a mouthful, yeah.
It's literally a mouthful. The fruit was mouthful, and then bad things happen from there. But then you still have the difficult task of explaining why God set up this just like terrible tree that, if eaten from, would ruin the world. So imagine I put a button in front of, if I gave nuclear weapons to a terrorist, you wouldn't say, well, it's the terrorist who detonated the nuke, so they're the one at fault. No, I'm also partially at fault. And so if you're explaining why there are all these bad things in the world, and your explanation for them is God set up the bring bad things into the world if someone eats from this tree mechanism, and then someone ate from the tree. Well, you have to explain why the hell God set up this whole, doomsday device, essentially, where if people ate from the tree, it would completely ruin the world and get rid of the world's perfection. So
I think the answer is something you probably won't think works, but I don't know. For me, it does. To me, the answer is just simply free will. I think God wanted to put a world forth in place where we can choose to disobey him, and if there was no possibility to ever disobey, then I don't know. I think if you can't choose to do otherwise, as libertarian free will would posit, then I think that there would be no such thing as good or evil, which is why good and evil knowledge of that entered into the world, because they had no knowledge of evil when they were living in a perfectly good state.
I obviously don't believe in libertarian free will, nor do I think it's coherent.
Oh,
but,
I didn't know that, actually. Okay.
Yeah, but I shouldn't have said that it's obvious. I know.
You were just like, I obviously believe there's no free will. I didn't know that.
I'm sort of undecided between compatibilism and no free will. But anyway, bracketing that entire discussion aside. So we could have imagined a world that God had set up where people had free will. They could have eaten from the tree, and then God would give them a stern talking to in response, rather than killing tens of thousands of children every day. So you once again have the difficult task of explaining why God made the response to eating fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, from why he made that response be all the terrible things. But even if you say that God had to make that be the response, well, so even if some evils entering the world had been the response, you could imagine a world that God would have set up where some evils entered the world, sure, but there were fewer evils. So imagine a world exactly like ours, but the response to eating from the tree of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, or fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, was just was a world exactly like ours, but no earthquakes that kill small children or no malaria. Presumably, we would still have free will in that world. So then you still have the difficult task of explaining why God made the particular spate of evils enter the world that he did.
I mean, I guess my response would just be that suffering entered the world at the fall, and like you
Wait,
said,
wait, wait.
you could posit that God should have made a world that's better because he's a perfectly good being, and I see that line of thinking, but I just don't think that it necessarily lines up with the Bible. I think that it just says like there's going to be suffering now, life's going to suck, it's going to be hard, and then you're going to die because the wages of sin is death, and
Okay,
that's what sin is it is choosing to do something that God would have us not do. So I think that, and like you said,
but just
you
saying the
could,
Bible says that there is an explanation, and the Bible asserts that that was the response, isn't an explanation of why that was the response.
sure, I could agree with that, but I think that I would just say that God gets to choose how he does it. He defines reality, and he created reality, therefore he defines it. And I think that also we're not giving credence to the fact that there are also, under the Christian worldview, fallen angels and Satan that also contribute. So it's not just, oh, uh God isn't stopping evil and he created a world with all the suffering, but you also have to understand the fact that there's evil spirits in the Christian worldview that are contributing to the evil as well, that have nothing to do with him, and he's not stopping them because of free will. And
Okay,
like
so
you said, you don't necessarily agree with free will, but I think that when you add everything holistically into it, it makes a little bit more sense, at least.
yeah, sure. So in terms of the point about fallen angels, well, you think I have free will, right?
Yeah, I think everyone does.
Right. Okay. But I don't have the ability to bring malaria into the world, and so
Sure.
robbing the fallen angels of the ability to bring particular evils like malaria into the world wouldn't rob them of free will. So that's not an explanation at all. That's just saying, well, God, other beings have the power to bring evil into the world, but that's not an explanation of why God vested them with those powers. It's clearly not necessary for free will, given that I have free will, despite not being able to do all the devilish things that those damn fallen angels are up to all the time.
I mean, I don't necessarily have like answer beyond what I've given. I think that what I've stated is probably what I would stick with, that we're in a fallen world, there's suffering, there's Satan, there's fallen angels. I don't think I think evil is explicitly said it will exist in the Bible. I don't think it is a defeater for Christianity. I do think it's a problem that theists should take seriously. I'm listening to you, and you're bringing a lot of things up that I'm definitely going to think about at the end of this conversation. But I just I don't see it as a defeater to Christianity, especially when we get to all the reasons why I'm a theist. We've
Yeah,
spent about
yeah,
30 or so minutes talking about why you're an atheist, but I have a ton of reasons why I'm a theist. And
right.
once
Let's
you
go.
accept the goodness of
Yeah,
God, and once you accept the arguments for God, evil as a non-contradiction, or not a contradiction, and not a defeater for Christianity, it's just something we have to deal with, and it's something that I have to just be like, yeah, I hear you.
yeah,
It
sure.
sucks.
So um, yeah, okay. So I mean, I feel like yeah. So let's talk about some of the reasons why you're a theist. So, and I'd be perfectly willing to grant there's some evidence for theism, but I think that all of the evidence for theism is that has virtually no evidential weight compared to the argument from evil. And then when we add in things like the argument from hiddenness, meager moral fruits, um,
Hmm. Sure.
problem of hell, problem of biblical contradictions, etc. It just completely blows theism out of the water. But so yeah, let's talk about some of it. So what are some of your arguments for theism?
Funnily enough, before I hop into that, you were the person that introduced me to the meager moral fruits argument. I saw you mention it on Twitter, and I was like, "What the heck is that?" And I had someone share an article with me on that, and that was really helpful. But that's a really interesting argument. But so some of the reasons I'm a theist, I would say the first one is one that we probably won't get to discuss much because it's unfalsifiable. It's just my personal experience. The Bible says in John chapter 6 that um, the Spirit will enter your heart and he will draw you into him, and if you accept him in faith that you'll believe. And I had that personal experience, and so I accepted that in faith and I move forward. So if there's anything you want to say to that, then we can go for it. But that would be my first one that I thought we
So
could skim past.
I think that the motley of different religious experiences show that religious experiences can't be a super reliable way of determining truth. Because if they were, then you wouldn't have so many different, there have been people who have had powerful religious experiences causing them to convert from Christianity to Islam.
Sure.
Um, uh, and we're figuring out the neural mechanisms for how it happens. So it doesn't require
Sure.
God intervening. It just requires people um
I
being
guess my only response I
incredible.
would say to that is the existence of false religious experiences does not entail that true ones don't exist. And that's,
It
I
doesn't
guess, so.
it doesn't entail that. But imagine we had a book and you were claiming that this book warranted you in believing in the existence of God. Except we
Mhm.
know that when a person consults this book, most of the people get wildly inconsistent things from the book. That wouldn't
Mhm.
prove that what you got from the book is false. It would just mean that it can't be very strong evidence that what was said is true. Um, and then I think particularly, I've read the Bible. I've read most of the New Testament. I need to
Mhm.
get around finishing it at some point. And I've had no experience. The only experience I had when reading it was one of, mostly boredom. And so,
That's
so,
fun.
and I think that if you just maybe this is sort of slightly unrelated, but if you just look at religious demographics,
Mhm.
like why would God why only a small percentage of people in Japan are theists and are Christians? Why would God be reaching out more to people in the US than in Japan, for example? It just seems like the
Mhm.
best explanation of these types of experiences will appeal to evolutionary and cultural factors rather than to the truth of the revelation.
I guess so. There were two claims there. Number one, you said you you read the Bible, had no such experience, and just mostly boredom. Which I mean, I think any Christian listening to this can sympathize with that. That they've read the Bible and been bored at some point. Like reading Numbers and Leviticus is not entertaining at all. So I totally sympathize
So
with you
then the
there.
Moabites went forth and brought forth 32 shipments of I don't know. That wasn't a specific quote. That was just sort of a general
Oh yeah, I mean that's
expression.
pretty much what it is. And then Leviticus is just a bunch of laws. It's like thou shalt not for like the entire time. So I totally understand that. Um, I guess when it comes to religious experience, the Bible says that if you seek with all your heart, you'll find. And so I don't know you. We just met over this Skype call, I guess we could call it. Um, so I would just say that if you seek with all your heart long enough, I do believe you'll find him. And I don't know how, if you are in genuine search of God or if you're just kind of wanting to uh, know the Bible more and that's why you're reading it. I don't know your purposes. So I'm not going to say, but I would just say if you genuinely search with an open heart for long enough, you will find him. And I had an experience where I was probably 3 or 4 years where I was really lost in my faith and I wasn't sure if I believed it anymore. I was raised in it and I was like, nah, I'm just gonna go do my thing. Went to college, all that stuff. And um I found God like again in my adulthood life or my adult life. So and it was a moment where I was like seeking and being like, okay, is this true? So I would say that that would be my response to that. And I think that um anyone can find him. I really do believe because God is all good and the invitation is open to everyone that if you really want it, you can find it. And I've experienced that myself where I was lost, didn't believe really, and I found him in that kind of heart posture. So I don't know. I think it could work.
Yeah, well, I'd say I have genuinely sought. But I mean, to the extent that you hold that claim, then you have to make the wildly implausible claim that, like, there are billions of people who seem by all accounts who raised Christians, who wanted to retain their beliefs, who, if anything, were employing motivated reasoning to remain in their Christianity, and yet they eventually gave it up. So I think, I mean, I was recently listening to Alex O'Connor talk about his experience and how he's for years, saw it and really wants to believe. And so to the extent you have to posit that those people are not genuine, and you're talking about billions of people, that seems like an enormous cost of the theory.
I mean, I think I saw that debate. Was that the one with McClatchy? I think you say his name. Yeah, I watched that debate as well. I really liked the way that he was really open and honest, and he's like, I haven't got like a degree in theology, and I still don't believe. So no, I really I'm rooting for him. Like I said, if you seek long enough, you will find. And I don't think that it's that he's not genuine. I don't think that it's that he's lying. I'm not saying that at all. I just think that, I do believe if he keeps his heart open and keeps seeking, that he will find God eventually. And
so you would make the prediction that God, that he would at some point become a theist, right?
If he's genuine, if he's really genuinely seeking God, then I do believe he will be a theist in the future. I do not know the motivations of his heart. I do not know how genuine he is. I don't know the guy at all. I'm going to take his word for it and say he's being genuine, and look forward to seeing him debating you atheists one day. I guess is what I'll say.
The thing is, like, yeah, I mean, I guess you can posit that, but that just seems like, I mean, if you have to posit that all of the atheists have not genuinely sought, when all the evidence seems to indicate that they have genuinely sought, when you have lots of people who have, sought with all their heart, all their mind, they've really, wanted to believe in God. It seems really implausible that someone, I mean, that someone who was raised Christian and then gave up their faith based on just that they thinking there wasn't enough evidence for it, and there was good evidence against it. It just seems really hard to imagine that every single instance of those people involves them being ungenuine, particularly people who don't convert.
Well, my claim isn't that they're being disingenuous or anything. My claim is more that it could be a lot of different things. Like I don't want to speak for any one person. There could be some people that aren't seeking with all their heart, and maybe they think they are, but they're not. There could be some people that are, maybe they got introduced to the problem of evil or the problem of divine hiddenness, and they had an immature faith. Maybe they hadn't saw the evidences for God, and they were kind of, they heard an argument like the one that you were giving earlier and thought like, wow, okay, I guess God doesn't exist, and I think a lot of people probably are in that boat. And I actually have a buddy of mine, we're in an apologetics group, and he used to be an atheist, and that was one of the things that he said all the time, was that he would debate Christians and they had no idea how to defend their faith. They had absolutely no idea what they were talking about. He could ask them simple questions and they would just be like, and he would hope that they would stop believing after that. And then one day someone had handed him the book Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis, and he was like, okay, wait, that's a good moral argument. And then he, kept reading and searching, and he found God, and now he's like a leader of an apologetics group. And, so I think that a lot of people that leave the faith, they are just approached with arguments and they're not prepared to defend them. And I think that's reasonable to think that happens quite a lot. And especially in our more and more atheistic society, I think before Nietzsche made his famous quote, God is dead and we killed him, right? Like before that, like 99+% of people believed in a higher power for all of human history. So I think that, and nowadays it's more like, I think just 2 or 3 years ago, Christianity was now no longer the majority of Americans are not Christians anymore.
But I'm pretty confident you're wrong about that. I'm pretty sure most Americans are still Christian.
I think what I saw, it was like 49%. It was like just under 50, but maybe I'm
Yeah, I
I
just
quoted.
Googled it. It's between 65 and 75%.
Okay, well, there we go. I guess whatever study I'm reading was a bad sample or something, but they were saying that uh, more and more people are just turning from faith and into atheism, right? And so I think in an increasingly materialist and naturalist world, I think it's reasonable to think that a Christian might come across someone and they're not equipped to, debate someone that is dealing with the problem of evil or hiddenness or meager moral fruits or different things like this, and then they get convinced away from the faith. And um, I think that the Bible tells us very clearly to put on the armor of God every day. And so if someone one day wasn't armored up, they could very easily an arrow could slip through. And so
Yeah, but
I
I
don't know.
mean, I mean, I'm an atheist, and I've read the best defenders. I've not read Lewis, but I don't know if Lewis qualifies as one of the best defenders. But I've read people like Swinburne, I've Plantinga, etc. And I mean, I just find Craig, and I just find them remarkably unpersuasive. I mean, just talking about like my own experience. I mean, I know with well, I mean, maybe not absolute certainty, but near absolute certainty that I am a non-resistant non-believer. I would quite like to believe in God. I'd be quite happy if there were a God. I hope there's a God. But I find the evidence to just be incredibly lopsided and to sort of overwhelmingly support the notion that there isn't a God.
Okay. Well, I mean, I'm glad to hear that you want to believe in God. I think that's a very noble thing. So you said you've read Plantinga, William Lane Craig, and all these guys. What arguments do you think, like you said, they're just completely unconvincing? I feel like a lot of the arguments posited by those guys are really sound and compelling. So, like, if I were to say, for example, like William Lane Craig's Kalam cosmological argument or something, like a lot of people have found that argument to be really compelling. I know that's like the most popular one to talk about. So,
Yeah, so we can talk. I mean, I find all of them uncompelling, but I I mean, I think that so. I think the Kalam provides a little bit of evidence for theism, but like really weak evidence. So my credence in all of the premise, like it only multiplies my credence. Like if I were previously at 1%, after that argument, I'd be at like 1.1%. Like
why is it what's so unconvincing about it? Because like which premise to you is just like, yeah, that's not doing it for me.
well, I think I don't find any of the premises to be correct. So we can talk about the first one, which is that everything which begins to exist has a cause.
Sure.
Um, well, so one, I think that the B theory of time is plausibly true. If the B theory of time is true, then that premise is false. So, and I would lean towards the B theory of time.
What makes you lean towards it? It's like almost purely mathematical.
Well, the B
It goes
theory of
against our
time,
experiences too.
I don't think the B theory of time goes against our experiences because we experience moments in time, but we don't experience like the passage of time. We experience one moment where we have memories of a previous moment. That's perfectly explainable in the B theory of time. And the B theory of time is the consensus both in physics and in philosophy. Well, it is the majority view among philosophers of time. And in the most recent field paper survey, most people are B theorists. I haven't waded too much into the B theory versus A theory literature. Wait, no, sorry. It's not most people, but it's more people are B theorists than A theorists, like 45 to 30% or so.
And this was under what group of people?
Of philosophers generally, it's a higher percentage of like philosophers of time specifically, and a higher percentage of physicists. But I haven't waded too much into the A theory of time versus B theory of time literature. But that's one of those issues where it seems like things get really complicated and technical, involving like physics. And so in cases like that, I generally just defer to what the consensus is. And so I as a result, I don't firmly embrace the B theory, but I just sort of lean to it, given that in areas where I haven't really studied them in depth, I just sort of lean towards whatever the consensus is. And so,
Okay.
given that
This is my problem with the B theory of time. Let me know what you think of this. I think that given the B theory of time, it is less likely, or it's, I guess, surprising that we would interact with the past and the future differently. Like we interact with the past through memories and we don't do anything with the past except remember it. But with the future, we make plans for the future. Like tomorrow, I'm going to go to work and I'm going to pack my suitcase and I'm going to go to my fiance's house, right? Like that's my plans for tomorrow. And with the past, I don't do any such thing with that. And so if eternalism is true, which is another word for B theory of time, to me, it seems implausible that we would interact with equally present moments with such difference. And I think that's a strong argument for the A theory of time, that we interact with the past in a completely unattached way. We interact with the future through plans and through, being excited about things, and we feel anxiety about the future. And we all also experience only moving forward in time. It seems like I've never experienced going back in time. I've never experienced like interactions with the past other than memories. And so I just think that the B theory of time is almost purely mathematical, and it goes against our everyday experiences. So to me, unless there's a really strong philosophical argument to be a B theorist, I would just reject it totally.
Yeah. So I mean, one point is just I think that the consensus which supports the B theory of time is generally taking those things into account. But I don't understand why the fact that time stretches in both directions and there's no objective present means that we wouldn't remember the past. So I mean, much like if you're looking at an object on a two-dimensional plane, the object might see behind it. And similarly, we could have memories of the past, given that there still is a way of ordering events. There is an order in which events happen relative to each other. There's just no objective
exactly
present.
But they just wouldn't be tensed, right? They would just be earlier and later. It wouldn't be like this happened in the past, this happened in the future. Like, because B theory rejects tensed language, right?
Right. But so we can still use it would reject tense language. There is no objective present. There still would be like a fact of the matter about like things happening before other things. But I think that my support for the B theory of time is largely just based on it seeming to be the view that are embraced by most people who share my philosophical presuppositions. And I think based on that, much like I have no idea what's going on with quantum mechanics. I find all quantum mechanics to be very confusing. But I'll just generally defer to like what the consensus is and have my credences be roughly spread out across what the consensus view is.
Sure. I think I would just.
So I would do that for the B theory. But even if the B theory of time is false, I still think none of the Kalam premises are defensible. So we could talk more about those, because I think
really
sparring on the B theory of time is going to be sort of less interesting, given that I just I don't have anything very interesting to say about the B theory of time.
Okay, so I guess the only thing I would say to that is, before we go on to the A theory of time, I think the B theory of time doesn't disprove the Kalam. I think that it just holds that all moments in time are equally existent. Like, it's called eternalism. So like every moment in time exists right now. And I would just say that the creation moment also exists right now. And God was outside of time before that. And so there was no change before that. And then, and so there was logical moments, as different philosophers have said. But as far as time itself, as far as time has existed, it would just be all moments exist simultaneously. And so I would say that even if the B theory of time is true, I would still say the Kalam works, and I don't see any reason why it wouldn't. But I guess unless you want to respond to that, we can go to the A theory.
Yeah. So just to address that, so I agree that you could still have God be the one who created the four-dimensional block. That's perfectly fine. But the point is, you don't need God anymore, because nothing begins to exist. Everything exists tenselessly as this sort of four-dimensional block.
But in things that did not exist in earlier periods, if we're abandoning tense times or tensed language, then they would still have that creation moment. Like, for example, there was a moment when I became an embryo, right? There was a moment, and the moment before that, I did not exist. And you could even say, well, maybe you existed in the sperm and egg of your parents, but let's just say before they were born, I definitely didn't exist then. There, even in the B theory of time, you could say like earlier then my existence, I did not exist. And so therefore I did come into existence. Even if moments in time exist simultaneously, there's still a moment on that timeline where I did not exist, and then the next moment I did exist.
Yeah, sure. So I think that's true, right? But well, so I mean, a good way of thinking of it is think of time as sort of like a four-dimensional block. Okay,
Okay.
so much like we don't need any cause of the leftmost point in the universe,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of the three spatial dimensions, we similarly wouldn't need a cause of the you know uh, uh, of the first moment in time, because it's just sort of different points along this four-dimensional um, this four-dimensional block. And Craig agrees with me. Craig thinks that the B theory of time refutes that if true, the B theory of time would refute the Coulomb.
Okay. Maybe I'm missing something because I don't see how that works. But uh, so the way that I see this is I would reject and push back that it still wouldn't need a cause. So Craig, in his defenders class, he gave this analogy where he says, suppose you're walking through the woods and you come across this blue ball, and it like looks like the earth, right? It's just got all this amazing stuff. It's beautiful, and then you shake it up and it's got like a snow globe. You would not just think to yourself, oh, that just came out of nothing, right? That just popped up out of nowhere. You would immediately think, oh, so there's a reason this is here. Or for example, this microphone I'm speaking into, it didn't just show up, right? Someone made it. And I think that in our everyday experience, we see that things before they have a cause. And then that obviously goes to the five ways of Aquinas, his arguments where he says that there had to be an unmoved mover, a first cause, an uncaused first cause, and pure actuality. And to me, that is the most convincing argument for God. Like if we want to go back into why I'm a theist, I think arguments from the uncaused first cause, arguments from contingency, these types of things are the most convincing arguments, because just based on our experience, everything has a cause. And so if, like, let's just say space time is like a row of dominoes that was set into place and space and time began, there had to be something that knocked the dominoes over. And I just don't see a world where the universe itself just has any properties within itself, intrinsic to itself, that would make it any different than you and I.
Well, so the generalization from everything within our experience that we see begins to exist has a cause. There are an infinite number of generalizations. So one of them is all spatiotemporal events begin to exist as a cause. And dude, talking about space-time beginning to exist is sort of confused, because space-time, the beginning, like time beginning to exist, seems sort of confused, given the time to begin, there has to already be time. And
Not necessarily.
Well, and if we're just gonna,
If God exists, he would transcend time, right? So
right, but he wouldn't be before time, because for there to be before, there has to be time. So he would exist
well,
outside of
yeah,
time.
he would
Exist
exist
sans
essentially.
time, but he wouldn't exist before time.
Exactly, it would be like logical moments before time began, right? So it would be before time existed, he was in a perfectly changeless state. There was no change because time didn't exist. But the moment creation started, time existed. And so I would say that space and time did begin to exist. I think the Big Bang Theory is good evidence for this. I also think there's really good philosophical evidence for this that William Lane Craig posits, like the impossibility of actualizing an infinite number of things, like an actually infinite number of things by
Well,
successive addition.
hold
So
on.
I
Now,
think the
now
past
we're
has to
now
be
we're
finite.
talking about premise two. Let's first sort of finish with premise one, that everything which begins to exist has a cause. Well,
Okay, sure.
so I mean, the only argument that you've given so far for that is that's true in our experience. But there are an infinite number of other generalizations you can make from things within our experience. So one of them is everything which that's true within our experiences. Every cause is physical, and so the universe can't have had a physical cause. Therefore, the universe can't have had a cause. And that has exactly the same inductive support as your principle. Or everything which begins to exist has a non-omnipotent cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a non-omnipotent cause. And that has exactly the same inductive support. Everything in our experience which has a cause has a non-omnipotent cause and has physical cause. Well, unless we mental causation, which actually I do. But
so I would disagree with that. I don't think that every cause that we experience has a non-omnipotent cause, because I believe in my worldview that God created all of these things, and so they do have an omnipotent cause. So I would reject that premise.
No, I know you would reject it, but if we look, so what you said is like, just go to the park. If you saw a strange looking stone, you'd assume that it had a cause. It didn't just cause nothing. But that obviously can't be applied to the universe. If it could, if you saw a stone at the park and you knew it had a cause, you would assume that the stone was not caused by an omnipotent being. And so if you generalize that principle, you'd get the universe had a non-omnipotent cause. The things that apply within space and time don't necessarily apply to space-time itself.
Okay, so that is a really strong claim that can't be applied to the universe. Like, I think that's, first of all, an unfalsifiable claim, so it's kind of hard to deal with. But I think that if we look to I think it's called the PSR, where it says like everything that exists has an explanation for its existence, whether it be through the necessity of its being or through an external cause. You would, through that logic, have to somehow prove that the universe has properties intrinsic to itself that makes it a necessary entity. And I think that we could easily argue that the universe is contingent because it could have been otherwise. I think we could easily imagine a world where unicorns exist. And to me, that just is a good argument for it being contingent.
Yeah, so I would reject the PSR.
Okay. Under what grounds?
So I think that so one, I would just make the conceivability argument. So one reason I would reject the PSR is I think the PSR plausibly entails modal collapse. So if there's an explanation for everything that is the case, then things couldn't have been otherwise, because for any state of affairs, there's an explanation for why that state of affairs ensues. And so let's say you believe in free will. Well, no, I mean, you do believe in free will. If you believe in free will, that means that there's no explanation for why I chose one thing instead of another thing. Given the entire nature of free will is it can't be overdetermined. It has to be your free choice, such that there's no such that the fact that you made a choice doesn't strictly determine what choice you would make. Instead, it's up to you. And so if we accept libertarian free will, then that means that for any phenomena, there won't be a sufficient explanation for its existence. And I also think that in order to believe the PSR, you have to think that the ultimate cause and foundation of the universe is necessary. But the ultimate foundation of the universe has a variety of properties that are not at all in common with any other thing that we know to be necessary. Every other thing that we know to be necessary is causally inert. It governs the relation between two things. It can be deduced a priori by a sufficiently rational entity, and it's inconceivable that it couldn't exist. But I have no trouble conceiving of God not existing, and I don't think that there's ever been a good argument for why the non-existence of God is inconceivable. Sorry, there was a lot there.
Yeah, a lot of claims. I want to go back to what you said before the last point you just made. You said, oh man, I'm forgetting what it was. Okay. I'm just gonna go, I guess, to the last claim you made. So, you said that free will. So there would be no prior cause to my choices. I would reject that. I think that my choices are caused by my will. I would say that the necessary cause, or the explanation of its existence, would be my will, which was created by God.
Okay, so but the thing then that's unexplained is why your will chose one thing over another. So so let's say that you decide to eat cookie A rather than cookie B. Why did your will choose to eat cookie A rather than cookie B? There can't be an explanation for it if libertarian free will is true. It's your choice.
So you're saying why couldn't it just be that I like cookie A more than cookie? Like, let's say cookie A is chocolate chip and cookie B is cinnamon raisin. I just like chocolate chip more. So I would
Okay, you
choose the
like
chocolate chip
so
cookie.
does the fact that you like it more mean that you'll necessarily choose it more? Or that you'll necessarily choose it? Because if it does, then that's giving up on free will. Then everything's straightly determined by your underlying preferences. And so it seems like
Well,
for there to be libertarian free will, there has to be some autonomous you who's free to choose either thing. But if you're free to choose either thing, and there's no foundational cause for why you chose thing A over thing B, well, then if that's true, then you can't have a reason for choosing thing A over thing B, or
well,
there can't be an explanation for why you choose thing A over thing B.
I don't think it follows that because I have preferences that therefore free will falls apart. I just think that sometimes we make decisions because we prefer one thing over the other, and that is a sufficient explanation. I don't, and then I think
Well,
for other situations, you would decide to do something for other reasons. Like, let's say, for example, I walk outside and there's some man outside trying to rob me. I would obviously defend myself. And that just seems like the most reasonable thing to do. I'm not just going to stand there and let him stab me to death. Right. So I think that we make decisions sometimes because of our preferences, sometimes because of necessity, sometimes because uh, it, we discipline ourselves. Like I went to the gym this morning and I really didn't want to. I didn't want to get out of bed at 6 a.m. and go to the gym, but I did. And it's because I want to lose weight. And so sometimes I do things even that I don't want to do. And I think that's a really strong argument for free will because uh, we are suppressing our carnal desires, and our carnal desires are always going to be stronger than our disciplined desires. And so I think the idea that we would always just choose the stronger force, because that's what a lot of people that deny free will say. They're like, you're always just going to choose the thing that you want to do more. I think that discipline is a hardcore defeater of this. I think that when I suppress my carnal desires, which are necessarily, even biologically speaking, more internal to me, they've been around for millions of years, there's no reason why I would not choose that thing over the get up and discipline yourself and make your bed and go to the gym and eat the healthy food over the ice cream. I think that's a successful defeater for the idea of free will doesn't exist.
but if you end up choosing A over B, then that means that your desire to do A rather than B is stronger. But so the point that I was making earlier, I think still stands. So you think that if even if you knew all the atoms in the universe, even if you had all the information, knew all the facts that could be known 1 second before you make a choice,
Mhm.
then you couldn't predict what choice you would make with certainty, right? If you
So
disagree
like,
with that,
so to
then
say
you don't
like I
believe in
knew,
libertarian free will.
so to
Like
say
that's
like I had kind of like middle knowledge, like God,
wait, sorry,
or
I don't know what middle knowledge means.
okay, so middle knowledge is a concept from Molinism, which is a idea that kind of tries to reconcile free will with God knowing the future. So basically, the idea is before God created the world, he knew every single possible world. And then after he instantiated this world, he entered into time. And so he's experiencing things along with us. And his middle knowledge includes the choices that we'll make. So before I make a decision, he's aware of every single possibility that I have in front of me. And then based on the information that he has, he then knows which one I will choose. And that's how he can know the future without overriding my free will. It's more that he understands the choices that I have. And because he fully knows me, he knows which one I'll choose.
Yeah, right. So it's not saying that. It's saying that let's say that you just knew the laws of physics. Let's say the psychophysical laws. Is there so is there any knowledge that one could have um, who has not looked into the future and already seen your choice that would allow them to predict what you would do in advance?
I don't think so. And here's
Okay,
why,
so
because
then
I
if
think a lot of,
well, so just to be clear, I'm not disputing that. Well, I would dispute that claim. That's not what I'm doing correctly. But if it's true that there's no previous information that strictly determines what you're going to do, then that means that if you choose A versus B, given that no previous information was fully the cause of that, no previous factors that could be known about were fully the cause of that, then that would mean that there's no explanation for you choosing A over B. And this is the very concept of libertarian free will. There's no fact about the universe which forces you to do A over B. It's your choice whether you do
exactly.
A versus B.
Yeah,
Right. And so
exactly. I don't think there's anything we can know about the universe, like our particles in our brain or anything like that. Like is that kind of the claim you're making? Like if I knew every
yeah, and
electron and
relevant
proton in my
like
mind, you would be
psychophysical
able to predict
laws,
my,
etc.
You would be able to predict my choices. So the reason I would reject that is because I believe we have an immaterial soul, and I think that that is what drives our choices. However, our soul is very much so connected to the brain. So like a lot of like gender theorists would say like gender and sex are like different, but they're very, very close together. That's kind of how I think the soul and the brain are. They're very, very connected, but they're different things at the same time. So like a lot of times when we discuss the functions of the brain and the functions of the soul, they might intertwine in some ways, but they're not necessarily, that doesn't make them the same thing. And so, and I think there's very strong arguments for the soul existing. And I talk about one of these on Twitter all the time. This is my favorite one, that if immaterial souls don't exist, so the material world is all that there is, then your physical properties are equal to you based on identity theory. Like you are the law of identity, that if all you are your physical properties, then anytime your physical properties change, you are a new person because your physical properties have changed. And so I think that that would mean that all your memories are illusions. Like the you that started this conversation with me is not the same person because you've used water, you've used food that you ate earlier. You're a totally different person than the one that started having this conversation with me. And I think that that's a very strong argument for the immaterial world to exist.
Yeah, I would actually I would agree that that's the implication, and I would agree with that implication. Um,
So you would
uh,
just bite that bullet and say, okay, I'm a different person.
why don't think that our memories are illusions? Or we are remembering someone for whom there's no fact of the matter about about whether we and them are the same person. So there's a good analogy given by Parfit of a club. So let's imagine that you have a club and you have that meets every Thursday, and then you have some new leadership take over and they rename the club, um, and the club becomes slightly different. Is it the same club? Well, it seems like there's no robust fact of the matter about whether or not it's the same club. That seems like it seems like it would just depend on, like whether or not it's the same club will be reducible. There's no like objective fact. It'll just depend on our definitions. And so I think that, to use that club analogy, if the club kept a record of what people had said in previous club meetings, even though it's not technically the same, or there's no robust fact of the matter about whether it's the same club, that wouldn't mean that the information about what it was said at previous club meetings is unreliable at all. That's not the implication. And I actually think that this conclusion is one that we're, necessarily led to. So let's imagine that you slowly had, well, yeah, I mean, we could talk about this, but I feel like, I have a pretty radical view about this, and I feel like we are getting a little bit far afield from the Kalam. Um,
Oh
uh,
yeah, that is where this started, wasn't it?
yeah. So,
Yeah.
but I mean, the broad claim is my broad feeling about like lots of these arguments is that you have these sort of speculative premises where I'm not very confident in any of them, and so like conjunctively, like my confidence in all of them together is like, pretty low. So they're like a little bit of evidence. So we're confronted with these like very complicated speculative philosophical and theological premises, and then we compare that to the premise there are bad things for which the world would be better in their absence, and that's just way more obvious than any claims about the A versus the B theory of time, or about everything which begins to exist having a cause, or about that cause necessarily being God. But yeah, so would you want to
Well,
move on to talking?
I
Sorry.
think there are very obvious truths that uh, lead to theism. Like for uh, like we were talking about earlier, arguments from contingency. I think there had to be a first cause. I think that's very intrinsically obvious. I think when someone says that, oh, there's infinite cause. There can't be an infinite causal spectrum into the past because we can't count to infinity, and so the past is necessarily finite. And I think that that's an obvious truth. It, I don't think there's any argument that would defeat that. Personally, I think that
Well,
the impossibility of actualizing an actually infinite number of things is a very obvious thing to say, where it's like, okay, yeah, the past is finite, there had to be a beginning, and so what do we get from that? There had to be an uncaused first cause at the beginning. that began time, because the cause of time can't be in time. It has to be above time. It has to transcend time. It has to transcend. It necessarily has to be a supernatural thing because it transcends nature. It transcends time. It transcends space. And
It
so,
must be timeless, spaceless,
yes,
immaterial, extraordinarily powerful, the transcendent cause.
yes, you sound just like William Lane Craig there.
Yeah,
But
that was my
I,
head.
I think that is very obviously true. Like when you think about it for a moment, I think it's very difficult to argue against something like that. And so, just like you said, like evil exists, and like we talked about earlier, I don't think that contradicts Christianity. And then we get to things like that argument where it's like, okay, that's obviously true as well. And then when we get to C.S. Lewis's moral argument in his book Mere Christianity, this is I think a really uh, strong argument for theism as well, because if we laid out William Lane Craig's version of the moral argument, just to lay that out, it's if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. Premise 2, objective moral values and duties do exist. Premise 3, therefore God exists. And I know that you would probably reject one or both of those, but I'll just lay
Yeah.
that out and then I'll give C.S. Lewis's moral argument. So essentially, he differentiates and draws a distinction between nature and human nature. So, for example, I have my phone here. If I were to drop it, if I were to just let go of it, it's going to fall, right? Because gravity, right? It's under the laws of nature, and it couldn't have done otherwise. It's under these laws. However, humans are different. And so humans have free choice and humans can do different things. And because of that, whenever someone does something, we can judge that action based on how right or wrong it is. So, for example, and there might be situations where the same thing happens, but we draw different moral conclusions from it. So, for example, let's say you and I are walking down the street, and then I just so happened to like step in front of you and you trip, and it was a total accident. And I'm like, I'm so sorry, man. And I like help you get up and we walk on. No one's going to look at that and be like, wow, Nathan, you're a jerk. However, if we're walking down the street or you're walking down the street and it's raining outside and I'm at a bus stop and then I trip you and you fall into a puddle and I'm like, haha, loser. And I get up and get on the bus. People are going to say, wow, you are a jerk, Nathan. Why would you do that? And that's the difference between human nature and the laws of nature, is that humans, whenever they act, we judge them. And I believe that, first of all, this is in the Bible. The Bible says that the law of God is written on our hearts. And so every person knows intrinsically that right and wrongs do exist, and there are universal right and wrongs. So when people try to say, oh well, there's different moralities within different cultures, there are universal right and wrongs, like murder and theft and sexual perversity and cruelty to animals, and all forms of government on the planet try to enforce some type of justice. And so there are laws that are universal. And if we look in moral psychology, there are 3 different moral frameworks. There's autonomy, there's community, and there's divinity. And then there's 6 different categories with which we can recognize something as a moral issue. And so I think that when we look at objective morality, I think there's no better argument that it's subjective than, number 1, we all have a moral compass and a conscience within us.
Just
And
to be
number
clear,
2,
I agree with you on objective morality. So you and I would be in agreement about that. So
okay, cool.
We didn't need
My 2 arguments for objective morality is just, number 1, everyone has a moral compass and a conscience, and number 2, that oh my gosh, what's my second one? I had it just a second ago. And number 2 is we can separate categories within morality and moral psychology, and we can identify them. And I think that makes it objective when we can identify outside of ourselves. It's not just this is an intrinsic thing. And so with C.S. Lewis's moral argument and William Lane Craig's moral argument together, I think that it logically follows that there's a lawgiver and that God exists. I don't think that morality just actually, funnily enough, I was reading a moral psychology book a couple months ago, and the way that the guy described it was just a happy accident in our evolution. Like we were evolving, and one day our genome made a mistake, and now we have morals. And it's just like, do we really believe that all human beings just had a happy accident in their evolution? Because there wasn't just one human being at the time when he said this happened. It was like pretty late in the development of human beings. It was even after Heidelbergensis, which is when we believe the first humans were. were actually showing signs of being human. So it's like, this is pretty late in the evolutionary history. And we just, every single person evolved to have
Yeah.
morality. I just don't find that
Yeah.
likely at all.
Yeah, sure. Well, okay. So one of the reasons I would reject the moral argument, uh, I would reject it for lots of reasons. It's actually, I think, the argument for God that I find the least compelling by an order of magnitude.
Sure.
Well, I mean, maybe the it and the modal ontological argument are sort of tied there, um, uh, but so one of the reasons is because of Euthyphro's dilemma. So the question is it good because God decrees it, or does God decree it because it's good? If it's good because God decrees it, then God could decree that you should torture infants for fun, and then it would be objectively moral to torture infants for fun. Um, if God decrees it because it's good, then it's good independently of God. Now, the common response is neither. It's whether it corresponds with God's character. But then the question is whether it's good because it corresponds with God's character, or whether it corresponds with God's character because it's good. And then you get the same the same problem.
I don't think so.
God's character.
I don't think that gets the same problem. So this is what I would say. You already said what I would say. I would split the horns and say it's neither one of those. That the something is as good in as much as it mirrors God. And whenever we think about that, we must recognize that part of being God is being a perfectly good being. And so when he defines what is good, it's because of who he is. And I think that that doesn't run into the same problems as the Euthyphro's dilemma, where it's like, oh, well, is it good because it's something outside of him or because he says so? I think it's just he is a perfectly good being, and therefore his thoughts are perfectly good and his judgments are perfectly good. And that's all the explanation that it needs. And I even think a lot of atheists who buy into objective morality would say that a lot of moral truths are necessary truths. Like it's
Yeah,
necessarily true that like it's wrong to torture people, right? So
yeah,
I think that
I would agree that moral
well,
truths are necessary truths.
but I think if God exists, then that avoids the Euthyphro's dilemma because they're necessary truths and objective morality exists, then they are grounded in his necessity, like he is a necessary being. And so I think that when you take all of that into consideration, it avoids that dilemma.
Well, okay, um, so let's imagine that God's character was such that he was in favor of torturing infants. Um, then would it be objectively immoral to torture infants?
I'd say that's a metaphysically impossible explanation or
Okay,
scenario.
so in so I would obviously disagree with that. And I think that that's actually one of the a decent argument against God is that if you posit that God is metaphysically necessary, then it would be impossible for God to be any different, metaphysically impossible. And yet it seems perfectly metaphysically possible and perfectly conceivable for God to be totally different. For God to have done things differently and for God to be different. And so, much like I think the zombie argument is like that zombies are conceivable is a good argument against physicalism. I similarly think that the argument from it's conceivable that God doesn't exist is a good argument against the necessity of God.
So I'm going to hop in there. I think that it doesn't follow that because we could conceive God to be differently, that therefore he could be different. I don't think that follows.
Well,
Because
so I
you said that you could perfectly conceive that he's different, but that doesn't follow that. Okay, now he is different, or he had
well,
to
it
be
doesn't
different.
follow that
Yeah.
he is different, but it gives us
Mhm.
some reason to think that he could be different. Um, so
I don't think so. I think that when you do a characteristic analysis of the Kalam cosmological argument posited by William Lane Craig, you get his all of these things laid out where he's a personal being, he's immensely powerful, all these different things. But also, when you get to the fact that he's a personal being and perfectly good, I think that like uh it says that he couldn't be otherwise in the fact that he like there's a lot of things he can't do. Like he can't create a square circle, or he can't create a married bachelor, or he can't create a rock that he can't lift or whatever, right? That classic question. Like there's a lot of things that God can't do. And I think that saying that he can't be different is not a knock on his omnipotence. I think it's just that he is the way that he is. He's necessary. He necessarily exists. And that's just that.
yeah, so okay, so well, so one problem Well, so the Kalam cosmological argument infers from the fact that there are things to there being a God, but it
Sure.
doesn't establish that God is necessary. And I mean, it
Okay.
seems like if we think of every other thing that is logically impossible, um, it seems like it is either the case that it's inconceivable, or that once we were informed of all of the facts, we would understand why it's inconceivable. So, like, I mean, the falsity of Fermat's last theorem is conceivable to me, but that's just because of an epistemic limitation on my part. And so, if I were fully informed, like if I understood the proof of Fermat's last theorem, then I would understand why it's not conceivable for Fermat's last theorem to be any different. But are there any other examples of truths that you think that when if we knew all the relevant facts, we could conceive of their non-existence despite them being necessary?
So ask that question one more time. Is there
Are there
any?
any other truths for which you think a fully informed agent would be unable to conceive of their non-existence?
So you're saying like if I was
For
fully
any other
informed,
any other necessary truths? Yeah.
so like 2 + 2 = 4, like that's a necessary truth. Is that kind of what we're getting at?
Yeah, but you, we can't conceive of a possible world in which 2 + 2 doesn't equal 4. But I can
Yeah,
perfectly
yeah, yeah. I
easily, I
understand
can
that. Yeah.
perfectly easily conceive of a possible world in which God does not exist. And the ways that people try to say that those can't happen is they'll just say, well, God is necessary. But right now we're trying to explain why God is necessary. So just saying that he is necessary isn't an adequate explanation.
So you're saying because we can imagine a world where God doesn't exist, it would follow that he doesn't, basically, kind of like a reverse
Well, no,
modal ontological argument.
it would posit that he doesn't exist necessarily. And so
Mm.
this doesn't rule out a God of the type that Swinburne posits, for example, because it could be the case that God exists contingently. But this would just rule out unnecessary being. And these types of conceivability arguments are frequently employed. So, I mean, the zombie argument is a classic example. And I think that the zombie argument is a very good argument against physicalism.
Hmm. Yeah, I disagree with physicalism as well, but
Are you
um,
familiar? Do you agree with me that the zombie argument refutes physicalism?
I'm honestly not familiar with the zombie
Okay.
argument.
Yeah.
So
So
yeah, I have no opinion on it.
we could describe the details, but that would maybe take us a
So
bit far field.
so I guess that kind of reminds me of like the ontological argument, like because there's the reverse modal ontological argument. So the first one goes, just to do it really short, like it's possible that God exists, therefore God exists. The reverse modal is it's possible God doesn't exist, therefore he doesn't exist. And both of those are logically consistent arguments, right? I think if it's possible that God does exist, then it logically follows that he does. If you look at Plantinga's version, but then the reverse modal obviously works as well, where if it's possible God does not exist, therefore he does not exist. And that is also a logically consistent argument. And so I think what we have to get at is it at least possible that God exists? And if it is, then I think it logically follows that he does exist. And because existence is a great making property.
Yeah. Well, so I don't think that. Okay. So now we're getting in the ontological argument. Well, so I think that if you define God as being necessary, then it's not possible that God exists. Much like we would say that that if you define a necessary unicorn as only existing if it's necessary, then I would reject the possibility of that. So there has to be some explanation of why it's necessary. And your explanation was that existence is a good making property,
Yeah.
or is a great making property. But the fact that a being, so if you say by definition, God has all the great making properties, well, that doesn't mean that God actually has great making properties. So you can say, similarly, a necessarily existent unicorn by definition exists. It follows from the definitions that it exists, much just like you say that it follows from the definition that God exists, because part of the definition of God involves having all the great making properties, but some of those great making properties involve existence. The fact that a being exists by definition doesn't mean that the being in fact exists.
Yeah, I know, but I would just say that the necessary unicorn, or so to speak, I would just say that that is metaphysically impossible because well, unicorns don't exist, so therefore that is a
Well,
metaphor.
I'd say God is metaphysically impossible because God doesn't exist.
I would disagree based on the other arguments we've talked about, the arguments from
Right.
contingency, the impossibility from infinite
Okay,
past.
but if you need those other arguments in order for the ontological argument to have any force, then the ontological argument fails.
Well, you don't need it for the ontological argument to work. I think the ontological argument works on its own. However, to me, it works as a cumulative case because, like I said, the first premise of the ontological argument is if it's possible that God exists, and then it goes down and follows that he does exist. And so you have to prove through a cumulative case that it's at least possible that God exists. And
Well,
then if you prove that in a cumulative case, then it follows that he does exist.
but the default is that necessary things are impossible absent an explanation for their necessity. So we assume that a necessarily existing unicorn is impossible. We assume that that a necessarily existing evolving wave function that evolves according to Schrodinger equations is impossible, even though maybe we have a reason to think it exists, because it's not a reasonable inference from x is defined as existing and x or as existing necessarily, and x actually exists, that x is in fact necessary. But
the thing is with God is I think God is metaphysically in a different category because we're talking about the creator of the universe. We're talking about the uncaused first cause. We're talking about something that would be different in kind to something like a necessary unicorn or the greatest possible island or whatever else you would want to posit in that place. But I think that if we think about God, he would be different in kind because we're speaking about a very specific thing in the fact that we're talking about the creator of the universe and the transcendent cause of the universe. And I think that because we're speaking about him specifically and God specifically, I just think that is irrelevant to those analogies that you were positing.
Yeah. So, okay, but I don't see a reason to think that it would have a special status.
Because it's the creator of the universe. So,
I'm
arguing that a necessary being does exist, and I'm arguing that from arguments of contingency, the impossibility of having an infinite past. So there had to be some transcendent first cause, and because of that is why we're positing God as a necessary being. I'm not positing a necessary unicorn because we don't need to. It's like positing extremities or whatever without necessity, Occam's razor, whatever it would be. We're positing something out of necessity because we need a creator of the universe based on these arguments. And so I think positing something beyond that is, to me, it's irrelevant to the conversation, but I see why you're positing it, but to me, it just doesn't. The reason we're positing God as a necessary being is because we have this question: why is there something rather than nothing? Why do we exist at all? Why is the universe so ordered the way that it is? Like, there's an argument I saw from I believe it was Isaac Newton way back in the day, and he asked this question, and I thought it was really interesting. So I would want to hear your answer to this. Do you think that ears evolved with no prior knowledge of sound?
The ears evolved with no prior. Yeah.
And how would an unguided process create such a body for us that is so lucrative to this world that we live in? How could you conceive, or your eyes? Do you think your eyes evolved with no prior knowledge of light and optics?
Yeah, and I think that there's an explanation that involves sort of very simple versions, like very simple mechanisms that have gradually grown more complicated. First, like just sensing light and darkness for like mating patterns or something, and then I don't know the details, but there are people who have worked out the details. But we're getting really far afield from the moral argument.
Well, now I'm talking about a necessary being. So now I'm talking because that's what we.
Now you're arguing that evolution or something can't explain the eyes, which doesn't.
Well, no. Well, I'm trying to say that there is a necessary being who is guiding the evolutionary process. That's what I'm saying. I'm not saying that evolution can't explain it. I'm saying that it's not unguided.
Well,
And I'm arguing
okay,
that it is a guided process.
yeah. So right. So I would reject that. But if God were contingent, then he could still guide evolution, presumably.
Sure.
So right.
But I think
this,
there had to be a necessary being, though.
Right. So okay. So I feel like we've sort of argued the necessary being point a decent amount. I don't think that there is a necessary being, but let's imagine there is a necessary being. Why couldn't that necessary being have just been the universe or the initial state, as Graham Oppie suggests?
Well, I think the reason for that is there's no properties that at least we're aware of within the universe that would cause it to exist necessarily.
What are there properties within God that cause it to exist necessarily?
Well, yeah, he's the transcendent cause of the universe. He would be above time, above nature, all that stuff. Timeless.
If you're just saying that God exists by definition,
yeah, he's pure actuality. That's how Thomas Aquinas put it.
Okay, I feel like so I would reject that pure actuality is coherent and that it entails the properties of God. But if you just say by definition, God has a property which entails existence, and I can just say by definition, the universe has a property which entails existence. Just any addendum you can make to God that makes God necessary can similarly be done with the universe to make the universe necessary.
I guess I just don't see how, because there's everything that we see within space and time. It has a beginning. It has no intrinsic properties. That means it had to exist. I easily could have failed to exist. I think Jupiter could have easily failed to exist. I think the Earth could have easily failed to exist. The sun could have failed to exist.
Why think the initial state could fail to exist?
Because the past is finite. And so if the initial state is something that is within time,
why can't
there had to be an initial state of conditions that the initial state of conditions had to be, how do I word this? I don't think I've ever answered a question like this. So the initial conditions of the universe would have to, there would have to be something before it, I guess, because the past is finite. I guess that is what I would have to say.
Okay, so why can't the initial singularity have been something from which space-time emerged? So it's been some non-God thing that causes space-time.
So you would say like time and matter is just an emergent property of what?
Well, of whatever the initial
conditions. So like things just emerge from conditions. Is that what we're saying?
Right. So I don't know the details of this initial state, but let's say, but I mean,
I guess why should I believe that?
Some timeless, spaceless thing that causes space-time. That's not God. Well, why should you believe it? Well, no. So
why?
So I'm just saying. Well, so I don't believe in this, but I'm just saying, even if we grant that the universe has to have a cause that's timeless and spaceless, well, I don't think you can get to it being spaceless necessarily. So it can't be both spatio-temporal, but it could be some spatial thing from which time emerges. But even if you get to that, well, and you say, which was your explanation, that it can't be temporal for why the initial singularity can't be necessary. Well, I can just say, okay, the initial singularity is atemporal, and then we're even. And so the point is just what you're doing with God can be done for the initial singularity. And then
I just disagree because I don't think, because if we're positing something like what Lawrence Krauss posited, like an infinitely existing like energy field, right?
Whoa! Don't tar me with defending the insanity of Lawrence Krauss. Lawrence Krauss is deeply.
No, I mean, I'm just giving an example.
I'm standing with Oppie, not Lawrence Krauss. Okay.
Okay. Well, I'm just trying to figure out what the initial conditions would be, because Oppie is saying that the initial conditions would have to be, I guess, infinitely existing is what he's saying. So I'm just trying to bring Krauss in because he's a popular, like the viewers will probably know him. He posited there's like a vacuum or something, right? So that could be your initial conditions. It could be anything. We don't know the details of it. let's
what
just
Krauss says is you get something from nothing, but what he means by nothing is a vacuum state. So it's not really something
yeah,
from nothing.
I agree. I think his book doesn't work, but I'm just trying to say like he said that like there was a vacuum, right? And so Oppie, if that is correct, then Oppie would say that that vacuum infinitely existed. Am I understanding that correctly? Like those initial conditions of that vacuum just existed infinitely into the past, basically.
Well, no, it's not infinitely into the past because you think that there's an impossibility of a past ending. Now I disagree with that. But let's say we grant that.
On
Well,
what
then
grounds?
you well, well no, I'm saying let's say we grant that you're right that there's the
Okay.
possibility of that an actual infinite is impossible. Well, you say that God existed absent time and
Hmm.
created time, so I can just say this initial singularity existed absent time but created time.
But that doesn't make any sense because for there to be for it to exist outside of time, change wouldn't be possible.
Okay,
So
well, sure.
yeah,
So when you say change wouldn't be possible, are you referring to physical possibility or metaphysical possibility?
physical because that's what's causing or space and time is physical. So we're talking about what
Well, okay.
caused
Well,
matter to
so
exist
I
in space and
so
time.
so if something's outside of time, that means that in the absence of time, it can't change. But after time is created, then it can change, right?
Yeah, but if there's an initial
Okay,
condition,
so we can just say that the initial condition didn't change absent time, and then time is created.
yeah, but that wouldn't follow because if there was no change, then the time wouldn't have started. Nothing would have
Well,
changed.
You say God has changed this absent time.
Yeah, but
So how
he's
did
metaphysical, not physical. We're talking about
so
matter and space.
well, okay, so we can say that this well, okay, so one, I think that you can have change absent time.
How?
Um,
That doesn't even
what
make
about
sense.
what
Isn't
about
time what measures change?
well, time may be a measure of change, and it may be a physical fact about the universe that only temporal things change. But I really think that our like intuitions about how change and causation work in the absence of time are just going to be very unreliable when it comes to such matters. But but but
But why does it have to be ambiguous though? I think we can just trust our experiences because that's all we have. And this is
we
what
have no experience of what causality is like when there isn't time.
this is something Darwin said that I agree with. I don't agree with a lot of stuff he said, but he said this. He said when we're positing uh something that for like a cause of something, we need to posit something that we know through our experiences will cause such a change or cause such a thing to happen. So like let me give you an example of like inductive reasoning basically. Like let's say I took a nap and then I wake up and I open my door to my garage and I see outside that like my car is wet and the driveway is wet. You could infer a couple of things from that. You could say, okay, well, maybe it rains, maybe someone washed my car, maybe someone dumped a bucket of water on my car for some reason. Those are all perfectly reasonable things. And then let's say I walk outside of my garage and then I look to the street and I see the street is completely dry, the grass is completely dry, but my car is wet, my driveway is wet. So now we've eliminated the possibility that it rained, but we've still got those other two. And then let's say I walk around to the other side of my car and now I see a soap bucket and it has a sponge on it. Now I can infer based on the evidence, oh, okay, so maybe someone washed my car while I was taking a nap. I wasn't there to see it because I was sleeping, but that's the best explanation and best inference to the best explanation that we can have. And so I'm thinking when we go back to the initial cause of the universe, if we're going to posit something, it needs to be something that we would expect to bring about such a change. And I don't think that in our experience that matter without can exist outside of time. And if it did exist outside of time,
But we have no
could
experience with anything outside of time. So I mean, like
exactly.
well, no, well, so, but we don't have any experience with God existing outside of time. I mean, our intuitions about what like matter and change are like outside of time just seems like just seems like an incredibly terrible way of. I mean, our pre-theoretic intuitions about complex metaphysical questions are not especially reliable, and particularly when they're about things that are literally inconceivable to us, relating to like you know. Things in the absence of time bringing about changes. Um, I just think our intuitions about those are going to be pretty unreliable. But So
I don't know.
I'd like you can have a final word on this, but I would like to go back to the moral argument because
Sure.
I don't know, I have like a bunch of things to say about the moral argument.
So I think the last thing I would like to say about what we just said is that it's from our experience that, uh, as most people would posit, that God is like an unembodied mind, right? Same way that I believe we're an unembodied mind. We're a soul that's in a body, or we're an embodied mind, but I believe that our souls will live beyond that. So I think that, um, from our experience, uh, minds make changes, and matter and time and different things like all these things that are, around us, they are not what brings about their own existence. And I think that minds do bring about things that did not exist before. And also, one of the, uh, I guess, characteristics that we would get from the Kalam is also he's a personal agent, because impersonal entities do not change. So, for example, my lungs are alive, but they're impersonal. And so they breathe, and that's all they do. And if they ever change that, I die. And so impersonal agents never change what they do. Same thing with cells. My blood cells, they bring oxygen to my body, and they never stop doing that. And so, from our experience, the only things that are alive that cause change are minds. And so, that is why I would say that a mind had to be at the beginning, because from our experience, that is the only entity through which change comes about that is alive.
Well, okay, so you said that, so the example of your lungs do cause change, right? And I mean, like gravity causes change. But
But
your
they don't
point,
change what they do. I'm just saying, like, my lungs breathe in air and
in
exhale
what
air,
sense do
and that's
you,
all
in
they
what
do.
sense, in, well, I mean, some your lungs die sometimes, right?
Well,
Or
that
your
then
lungs,
they would no longer be alive. Then is my point. Like, a
well, okay,
non-personal
but
entity or thing doesn't change. So gravity, for example, it never stops doing what it does. It only brings things to the
well,
ground.
okay,
Like,
but I mean, a person may have become paralyzed where they no longer are able to move in the same way. Their limbs can no longer move in the same way, and that may even rule out the possibility of their much muscle involuntarily twitching. And so that's a thing where they're well, so like their body part is not itself alive, but it changes its purpose. It went from twitching sometimes, from being able to be moved, to not being able to be moved.
yeah, but that would be because it was disconnected from the spine, and then the body is no longer able to communicate with it
Okay,
the same way it used
I
to.
guess we can use a non-biological example. I mean, a star that emits light and heat will at some point go to not emitting light and heat. Um,
Yeah,
I
but
guess I'm
during the span of it being a star, it will never stop doing what it does, which is shine and emanate heat and whatever else stars do, have
okay,
gravitational forces.
but if you define a star as being such that it has to emit light and heat, then that's just a tautology. It's true by definition. It doesn't prove anything. I mean, if you, but I guess I don't understand the sense in which humans cause changes in a way that is required for the start of the universe.
Like, a lot of the things that we see on our screen right now did not exist, and could only exist because humans exist. So, like, these computers that we're speaking on, these microphones, like, humans brought these into existence, and they did not exist before. And it was only because of a mind that that was possible. If we didn't have our brains and the ability to maintain information and the ability to think cognitively and functionally, I think that humans and minds bring things into existence that did not exist before. And so that's one of the strongest arguments, I think, for God, is that he's an unembodied mind, because he brings about change in things that did not exist before. And based on our experiences with impersonal entities like gravity and stars and all the things I mentioned before, they never change what they do while they exist. Like, stars are never going to stop doing what they do until they die. And in the same way, gravity is never going to stop doing what gravity does, and et cetera, et cetera. So
But,
in clouds, they absorb water and then they rain, and that's what they do, and that's all
but
they
this
do.
would depend on the phrase "doing what they do" is ambiguous. So, like, I mean, would you say an AI change if an AI goes from playing one game to another, or from like playing chess to figuring out designs for chemical weapons? Would you say the AI has changed what it's doing?
Well, the AI would only be able to do that if a human being encoded it to do so. It
Well,
would not be able to do so otherwise.
well, we could imagine the AI doing so. So we could just imagine some implausible chemical accident which resulted in a fully formed AI, and that that's physically immensely improbable, but it's like metaphysically possible, and so it does prove a counterexample to the
Is
principle that
it?
you're
I
espousing.
don't know. I don't know if that's
No, I mean,
possible.
well, no, I mean any so the way that humans build AI is by like putting metal together. But you could imagine some vastly improbable like hurricane throws together metal in random hyper precise ways that just happen to form an AI. I mean, anything that humans can do could, in theory, be done by natural processes when it comes to AI construction. It would just be
Is that
immensely
kind of
improbable.
like the monkey argument where they're typing and eventually they type Shakespeare type
Yeah,
thing?
yeah.
Yeah, just anything is possible. I mean, I guess you could say it's
Right. So
possible,
that would be one counterexample. But I don't know. I don't understand what you mean by doing something different.
but the
So
AI would still not be able, it wouldn't have anything programmed into it. So even if it could technically be put together, it
well,
wouldn't
no,
be able to
no,
do anything otherwise unless a mind put it to the like programmed it. So I think even still
well,
in that
no, no. You
example,
could have it be programmed through the random hitting of buttons and wires by falling objects from the tornado. I mean, this would be the most like would be less probable than monkeys typing Shakespeare, but it's still metaphysically possible.
I mean, I guess because you would be programming an AI in a different computer because they put like chips in an AI to make it have what it has. So this hurricane would have to type an entire program on a different computer and then take the chip out of the computer and then put it in your AI. Like it would take a lot. So I mean,
No,
obviously,
no. I'm not disputing that how unlikely this would be,
yeah.
but it's possible. I mean, so like let's imagine that you have a hood of something that like bounces off and then takes the flash drive out that was constructed. I mean, none of this is ever going to happen, but this is
Yeah.
possible. It shows a counterexample to your principle. But I don't understand what you mean by changing what it's doing, right?
I just
So,
think if it's something that's never going to happen, I don't know if it counters my principle. I know it's metaphysically
well,
possible that it
it shows a
could.
metaphysical possibility of it.
It's a metaphysical possibility, but it's never going to happen, and it doesn't
Okay,
happen.
so what do you mean by being the type of by changing what it does?
So
Because that
for
doesn't seem
example, like I am speaking right now, and then I could in the next moment not speak by choosing not to, or I could pick up this water right here and drink it. I just changed what I was doing. However, gravity, the entire time we've been sitting here and forever into the past, that since gravity has been a thing, it has done the same thing. And so that's what I'm
will
talking about.
stars change their life cycle? I mean, planets go from being small to being big. They go from
But that's
attracting
through
other objects.
gathering. That's through gathering stuff, but which is also impersonal. It's through external causes to itself. It's getting bigger and bigger. It's not because it's doing something different.
Well, and I think that we change because of external causes, right? Like
Yeah,
I think that there are
but I
things that
again, I
depend
believe in
that
free will though.
determine.
So I believe we
Right,
can
right.
choose something
Well,
else.
okay, right. But so if your claim relies on a controversial metaphysical thesis that I reject, it's just not going to be dialectically persuasive.
Yeah, but you just posited a metaphysical possibility that's never going to happen as a counterexample. So I could immediately say the same thing.
No, but you agree with about the metaphysical possibility of that. And if there's a metaphysical possibility of a counterexample, then a absolute metaphysical claim can't be true. Um,
Well, I think
but I
what
agree.
we're positing,
If
what we're
that was the only counterexample, you could make a strong inductive case, but it would just be a counterexample to the
well,
absolute.
but that's what I'm trying to make the point is though, is that impersonal entities don't ever change what they do. And it's only minds that do so. And even if like, let's just grant your example where some random crazy AI gets made, right? It still would not be a free choice. It would be something that just happened to exist now. And so I think minds are the only things that choose to do differently. And I think that's the key distinction when it comes
Well,
to this
but
mind
but now you're
distinction.
just saying that only minds have free will, but I would dispute that minds do have free will. But wait, sorry. Yeah, so I feel like we sort of hit that point home. But let's go back to talking about the moral argument.
Okay, let's go for it.
At like 5 times when we've like gotten to everything. So okay, yeah. So well, so so what I mean, one objection is that um, if morality is just about what God's character is, well, then
Mhm.
you can adopt a form of ideal observer theory, where you say morality is about what God would decree if he existed. And all the arguments for divine command theory can support that form of ideal observer theory.
So morality is what God would decree if he existed. That's what you're saying?
Yes. Or it's what would correspond with God's character if he existed.
Okay, so how does that rebut the moral argument? I guess I'm missing the point you're making.
Well, you're saying that if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties didn't exist. But
Yes.
I'm saying this is just another perfectly adequate account where you say objective moral values and duties that what God would do if he existed, and you say God doesn't, but you say God doesn't in fact exist.
But that would assume that we're perfectly reasonable and we're not.
No, it doesn't assume that.
Because we're trying to assume the morality of a perfectly good being. So we would have to be perfectly reasonable in order to reach such conclusions.
Well, no. Well, you think that you have your morality based on, you think you have moral knowledge based on what God decrees, right?
Yes.
Uh,
That's through special revelation, though. That's not from, we
wait,
don't
wait,
believe that.
So, okay, so now you're making two claims. One of them is a claim about moral ontology, and one of them is a claim about moral epistemology. So we can talk about the claim about moral epistemology in a moment, but let's first stick to the ontology question. But
Sure.
do you think that the account that says that morality is about what God would decree if he existed is an adequate account of moral ontology as an alternative?
I think from an atheistic worldview, that's what you would probably have to say, right?
Well, I don't think that's what you have to say. This is one of many good options. But do you think that there's any reason, aside from independent reason to think there's a God, to prefer that account to the account that says that morality is just about what corresponds with God's character?
Morality is just what corresponds with God's character.
That's your account, and this is and this other account is morality is what would correspond with God's character if he existed.
I'm not sure how I would respond to that. I think my initial thoughts is that God necessarily exists, and so that's where morality comes from.
But what you're saying right now is you're even if God necessarily exists, you can still appeal to premises that ask about what would happen if he didn't exist. Indeed, the first premise of the moral argument is if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties don't exist. And so you can't just rule if you know what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander, as Craig is fond of saying.
Sure.
So if you get to talk about what objective morality would be like in the absence of God, despite thinking God is necessary, well then I get to talk about then I get to provide an account of what morality would be like in the absence of God. And this is one of many plausible accounts. And it seems like every argument for divine command theory can be used similarly to support this argument.
Okay. I'll grant your premise just to see where you're going with it. I have to think about it more.
We can have an atheist version of objective morality, and this is just one of many ways of doing it.
I think. Okay, so I think when I look at objective morality, the way that I put it forward earlier, it's we all have a conscience, and there are universal rights and wrongs, and then.
But now you're talking about moral epistemology. So that's about how we know that there's morality. That's about how we act in moral ways. But that's not about what morality fundamentally is. So presumably you would agree that on the atheist worldview, we as evolved social primates would have our own moral code. You just think that there couldn't be an objective morality, an objective right and wrong. But so we can talk about how moral epistemology works in a moment. But this just shows that you could have moral facts in the absence of God.
Okay, I see what you're saying. I'm talking about how we know that morality exists, and you're trying to just say that morality can't exist without God, and here's how. Basically.
Okay. So just to be clear, you would agree? Would you agree with me that that there would be morality in the absence of God. We just wouldn't know about it.
Sure. I guess I could grant
Okay.
that.
So then you would disagree with Craig's argument and Lewis's argument that if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. You think that if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties would still exist. We just wouldn't know about them. Right?
Okay. I guess the reason I said yes is because I think that it's the way that I view morality, kind of like we talked about in Euthyphro's dilemma. So I think that there, what is good is in congruence with God's character, and so therefore they're necessary truths. And so I think that, but the reason I think they're necessary truths is because they're grounded in God's character. And so I guess I
But
misunderstood
now
where
you're
you were
going
going with that.
now you're
So
going back to the ontology claim about how. So do you think that in the absence of God, there couldn't be objective morality?
I guess I would have to say no then. Yeah.
Okay, so
No.
okay, sure. So we can talk about the argument for moral knowledge. Because I agree with you that the argument, well, so I think you and I so far agree that I think the argument for moral knowledge is a fine argument. But I think the traditional version, the Craig C.S. Lewis style argument about if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. I think that argument is just a terrible argument and it's false philosophy. And so, okay, so now in terms of the argument for moral knowledge, well, I think that we have the ability of having moral knowledge through our ability to reason. So I think what morality is about what we would do if we were fully rational and impartial. And I think that if we were fully rational and impartial, given our ability to reason about things like mathematics, I think we can similarly reason about morality. So the same process that allows us to figure out things like Fermat's last theorem similarly allows us to figure out things like that it's wrong to torture infants. And I think we can also have direct awareness of some moral facts. So when a person's in pain, they're directly aware of the badness of pain that they gain merely by virtue of experiencing that pain.
Sure. I think the only issue I would have with that kind of thinking is that when we look into moral psychology and we look at the different categories through which morality exists within, there are people come to different conclusions. And so I think that when we look at like different societies around the world, would you just say that those societies are unreasonable, that they're just not in accordance with what we have decided is moral? Because like, I don't know,
Yeah,
for
I mean,
example,
much like there are lots of societies throughout history that have been wrong about science. I'm perfectly willing to grant that many societies throughout history have been wrong about morality. I mean, for example, I think that Islamic countries that are perfectly fine with female genital mutilation and throwing gay people off buildings, I think that they're wrong.
I do too.
Yeah, so I think that they're being objectively wrong. And yeah, so but again, remember, you and I are in 100% agreement about the moral ontology, that there's a fact matter that exists independently of what people think about it. But I think that I don't see an analogy. I don't see any disanalogy between the types of disagreement we see in the moral domain and the types of disagreement we see in the scientific domain. And we think that we can have scientific knowledge in the absence of God, but so why shouldn't we think we can have moral knowledge in the absence of God? Appealing to disagreement also applies in the scientific domain, and in nearly every domain is there disagreement.
Well, I mean, I would also disagree that we can't have scientific knowledge without God. So that would be, I would deny that premise.
You think we can't have any scientific knowledge without God?
Well, yeah, I think that God is, first of all, he's the necessary ground of reality. We wouldn't exist without God. So we wouldn't be able to do science. We wouldn't be able to be here sitting and having this conversation. We wouldn't be able to do anything without him giving us life and creating us. And so I don't know. I would say that nothing is possible without God and his creation. But so I think it would just fall from that.
But let's imagine that. But even though you think that, so there are some things that you think, like you think cats couldn't exist absent God because you think that God is the cause of everything, including cats. But you don't think that the argument for cats would be a good argument for theism. And similarly, if you think that the reason why you can't have scientific knowledge absent God is not because of special features about scientific knowledge. You think scientific knowledge is much like cats in that regard, but just because you think that you couldn't have anything without God. Well,
Yeah.
then at that point, then the argument for moral knowledge is just if it's analogous to the argument from scientific knowledge, is just an extension of other arguments like the argument from change or the argument from or some version of the Kalam. But then it doesn't have any independent force because it relies on already agreeing with the Kalam or some other argument.
Well, I don't think the moral argument relies on those things. You were just making an analogy about knowledge from science, and I was just saying I don't think we could know that either without God. I don't think that the moral argument relies on those other arguments to work. I think it works independently. I was just saying that I don't think your analogy works because I don't think that would exist either without God.
Right. But even though you agree, you don't think it could exist without God. You think that the argument from scientific knowledge doesn't have any special force, right? So if you didn't accept the Kalam or the argument from chain, then you wouldn't think that argument had any force. So all of its force is parasitic on other arguments. And so, do you think that so then it seems like the argument from mortal knowledge can't have force that isn't parasitic on um, on other arguments?
Well, I think under the theistic view, it's just widely accepted that God is the ultimate grounding of reality. And so if he grounds science, he would have grounded the creation of the universe. He would have grounded science itself and the natural laws. He would have grounded us. He's
Yeah.
the grounding of morality. And so I do think that if
Yeah,
you
yeah,
look at it that way, like, of course, God is going to, it's all going to point back to him. But I don't think that that means necessarily that all these arguments don't exist independently. I do think that the moral argument works on its own. I don't think it's dependent on the other ones.
So why? So what's wrong with my account of how we can have mortal knowledge based on our ability to reason about things and having direct access to certain moral truths like the badness of pain?
I would just say because morality comes from God, it would require us to be perfectly reasonable, and humans
Wait,
are
but,
not
but,
perfectly
but
reasonable.
Nathan, earlier you agreed that that morality ontologically isn't about what God commands. It's only how we know about morality that's based on what God commands.
I don't know if I agree with that. I think it ontologically comes from the necessity of his
But,
character.
but remember the atheist account that I gave of morality prior to
Sure.
saying that, which is just one of many accounts. And I don't agree with this account, but this is just one of many ways of having an atheist object to morality. It's saying that morality is about what God would decree if He existed. And so all your arguments for how divine decrees can ground morality can also apply in the case of the atheist morality, because the atheist can just say that morality is about what God would decree if God existed. And so, and I'm pretty sure you said verbatim, unless I'm like hallucinating, that you thought that like God was not ontologically the foundation for morality. That you disagreed with Craig and Lewis's version of the moral argument.
I I did initially, but when I thought about it a little bit more, I denied it afterwards. I Because whenever you said it the first time, like I had never heard that before, and so that was just I was going with my gut reaction. But once I thought about it for like a few seconds, I realized like no, I do think that it's grounded in God, and therefore you can't know. It would require you to be perfectly reasonable, and humans aren't. And I think that that is
Why would
the
it
defeater.
require
I
you
think
to
the
be
defeat.
personally
I think the
reasonable?
defeater of that would be the different cultures in the world that have different morality. I think that um, because you like that you would basically be saying, oh well, then just use the example you gave earlier that Muslims throw gay people off buildings or whatever. You would just be saying that everyone that agrees with that idea is just more unreasonable. And I just don't think that it follows that those people don't have the same ability to reason that we do. I just think that they're raised in a different framework that we're not. And in the West, we're raised in, like I said, there's three major frameworks for morality. There's autonomy, there's community, and there's divinity. And in the West, we are primarily within divinity and autonomy. I would say most Western educated people are within autonomy. And then uh, in Middle Eastern countries and like China and different places like that, they are more so in the community. Like they have the community framework, and some those that are religious would have the divinity one as well. But I think that's the major difference, is that they just have a different moral framework than we do, and therefore it's not that they're unable to reason; it's that they just were raised in a different culture, and they have a different view of like God gives us morality. However, they because they're raised in a different framework, they see it differently, and then they have different immoral actions within that framework. So for us in the West, and I don't want to talk about this forever, but I'm just giving one example. I think abortion's immoral, and that I think that is one place where the autonomy framework has immoral implications when we take it to its logical conclusion. In the same way, if we're looking at community, they have immoral things that happen, like let's say arranged marriages. Like we would say that that's, I want to marry who I want to marry, right? So I think each framework has places where people have downfalls within them, and I think that's the issue.
Okay, but so much like you would say that disagreement wouldn't, like you don't think that disagreement would threaten your model of objective morality, because you think like, okay, Muslims have their view of what objective morality is because they think God commanded X, but they're wrong. God didn't command X. So in
Sure.
this case, we're saying, okay, Muslims and Christians think God commanded X, God didn't command X, but God would have commanded Y, therefore Y is correct. I don't understand what the difference is in terms of how tough the disagreement is to explain for my theory versus your theory.
I'm just I think the way that I view objective morality is just that because other cultures have different morality, it's not because they're unreasonable, which I think that under your view, that would have to be the answer, is that, oh, well, we just reason better than they do because morality comes from reason. So you would just have to argue that they're just more unreasonable than you are. And I just don't think that's the case.
Well, so I don't think that you do have to argue that. So I don't think that the only cause of our moral beliefs is reason. I think there's lots of emotional factors and community and social pressures and evolutionary factors that go into our moral beliefs.
Okay.
But so as a result of that, I think that if countries are throwing gay people off rooftops, we can say, well, if God existed, God wouldn't like throwing gay people off rooftops. Therefore, what you're doing is objectively wrong. Like I don't understand what this. So much like you're not saying that they're like inherently less rational, but you are saying they're making a mistake of some sort.
And I think that we make mistakes here in the West too.
Right, and I would say similar, and yeah, I would agree with you that we make mistakes in the West. But I would say similarly that when we or whoever makes a moral claim, their moral claim is false, they're making a mistake of some sort, and that doesn't require saying that they're like inherently less rational. It just requires saying that they're making a mistake, and I don't understand what's wrong with that account of morality.
Well, I just think that if we think that morals come from reason, like that's the epistemological grounding for it, then I just think that it follows that if people are making way more mistakes than us, like we would probably say that a lot of Eastern countries are far less moral than we are. Like in North Korea, for example, like the dictator there is crazy, right? So I would say that to me, it would just logically follow that he's just irrational, which I think he is.
Yeah, but sure. I would agree. No, I mean, I'd be happy to say that other cultures are well, I mean, whether other cultures would be less moral than our own would be an empirical question. But I tend to agree. I think that I think our foreign policy is pretty horrendous. But I think that in terms of like our cultural values, I think that the U.S. has much better and more rational cultural values than like North Korea or Iran or Saudi Arabia.
I would just say that America's values did not come from reason, though. In fact, a lot of the original conservative thinkers that created the Constitution and all that stuff, they uh, they got it from like tradition from England, basically, and they got it from English common law and the Bible and different things like this. And so, the, even that, if you were to say like, oh well, America is probably better, well then the grounding for the Constitution, a lot of it came from the Bible and came from morals from the Bible. And so, even granting that and saying that, you know, America's got it better, then we're even granting that the grounding for that is a lot of that is from Christianity. And
Yeah.
I don't know. I think that that is even a good argument for, you know, the moral argument. If we're saying that the one of the most moral societies in the world, I won't say we're the most moral society, but you know, we're up there and we're grounded in Christianity. I think that also gives credence to Christianity.
Well, okay, so I mean, I that may be a little bit of evidence for Christianity, but I don't think it's much.
Oh yeah,
Um,
I don't think
and
it proves Christianity. I just think it makes,
right, well,
if you
but
were to look at, if you were
I
to
also
look at
think
like Islam and what they're doing, like what you mentioned, and then Christianity, and you look at the different morals posited by
yeah,
those, and then you say which one of those is closer to a perfectly good being, you would say Christianity.
but I think that argument would be evidence for like Jainism maybe because I think Jainism may be the most moral, or evidence for Judaism because Jews are responsible for a huge percentage of like Nobel Prize winners and a bunch of important scientific discoveries.
Sure,
Um, I I would agree that the the argument for meager moral fruits is a bigger problem for
sure,
is a bit would favor Christianity over Islam, but
yeah.
because I think Islam.
So,
Christopher Mingy asks a good question, which is if
oh,
morals don't come from reason, if there are objective moral answers, is normative ethics as a philosophical field pointless?
if morals don't come from reason, but there are objective moral answers, is normative ethics as a philosophical field pointless? I guess I don't know what normative ethics are. I'm unfamiliar with that term.
Normative ethics is like the in philosophy the like study of which is the correct moral system between like deontology, consequentialism, and
Oh,
the
okay,
the
okay,
the notorious disgraceful virtue ethics.
okay, sure. So there's a quote that I quoted on my Twitter yesterday, and basically it said that a lot of times what we think is that our customs in our countries, they often to us seem like they're just natural law. They like come from God, and when in reality they just come from customs that have been passed down from generation to generation to generation. And so I think that when it comes to, can you pull the question up one more time? Sorry, I just wanted
Yeah.
to uh so when it comes to morality specifically, like there are objective moral answers, but um, I totally lost where I was going with that. I feel so bad now. Um, do you remember what I was saying before I stopped talking?
I You were saying that you talked about how like we often think that what's being done by our society is objectively correct, and is that
Yes.
that's why it's not.
Okay, yes. So yeah, there was this quote I like, and he said basically like a lot of our morals, they come from traditions that have been passed down from generation to generation to generation. And we think that we're just getting them from reason, like, oh, I'm just perfectly rational and thinking that I don't need to throw gay people off roofs. But in reality, that has been passed down for centuries in Christian moral framework. And that's what all of us were raised in, whether we want to believe that or not. We were raised within a Christian moral framework, whether it be the Constitution, whether it be going to church as a kid, whether it be just, the normal morals that we see within our lifetime. And so we're not getting our ideas of morality from reason. Like we might, and, and Aristotle said it this way. Aristotle said that for something to be self-evident, in a deep sense, it's not that it means that everyone everywhere will recognize it to be true. So, like, obviously, in those Middle Eastern countries, they think it's self-evident that you should throw gay people off roofs, and we don't, right? And so Aristotle would say that whenever you are exposed to a truth that we would now say is self-evident, you can no longer not see the truth in it. And so, in other words, once I realize that it's not okay to throw a gay person off a roof, I can't unsee that truth. And so, as we've been exposed to so many self-evident truths within our life, it's not as much as, oh, I just reason to this now, and it's more so it was exposed to you, and now you can't unsee it, and so now it's perfectly reasonable for you to come to these conclusions, but that wasn't how you got there in the first place. And that's what I would say to that.
Okay, but so then, do you think that we can reason about like I'm perfectly willing to grant that uh, emotions and tradition and culture, etc., all play a significant role in our moral decisions. But I think we can also, in some ways, reason our ways to our moral decisions. Right. And I think if you don't think that, if you think that we can't reason our way to our moral decisions, then normative ethics as a discipline is just doomed. Um, so I think that there's this thought experiment called the repugnant conclusion, and lots of people don't like the repugnant conclusion, but there are really good arguments for accepting the repugnant conclusion. And so I think we should, but it seems like you would have to just give up entirely on the project of reasoning about ethics if you think that reason can't be used to figure out ethical truth.
I think that it's not that reason can't be used. It's because now it's, like I said, it's perfectly reasonable now to think that I shouldn't throw a gay person off a roof, but it wouldn't have been if I wasn't raised here. Like if I was raised in the Middle East, that would not be a self-evident truth because I wouldn't have been raised around that. And so um, I would just say that we can use our reason now that we see the self-evident truth that all men are created equal and we have inalienable rights endowed to us by our creator. Like now that that truth is in our system, whether we, you know, believe in God or not, that's our moral framework for this country. Now we can see it, and now we can reason about it, and we can talk about it and say, oh yeah, well, all men are created equal, we're humans, of course. And now it makes sense when we think of it that way. But that wasn't self-evident. Like in the past, people would just like sacrifice babies to Baal, and like people would grab slaves and like cut their hearts out of their chests and cut their heads off and throw them down a giant flight of stairs. Like the idea that all men are created equal and we're all the same was not self-evident in any sense of the term. And it was actually Judaism and Christianity that introduced that idea into the world. And so the idea of imago Dei, we're made in the image of God, that is where that comes from. And so I think that when we see these self-evident truths and we realize they came from Christianity and Judaism, I just think that, it's just another one of those things that
But there are
makes us
lots of
reasonable.
self-evident truths that obviously did not come from Christianity or Judaism. So, to just take a simple example, the truth that if you have two worlds and one of them has higher average utility, total utility, and more equal distribution of utility than another world, and it's a better world with respect to utility. That's found nowhere in the Bible, nor is it hinted at anywhere in the Bible, nor does it follow like Jewish tradition in particular. But I think that that's a self-evident. Well, I'm slightly hesitant to use the language of moral self-evidence.
Could
But
you define utility in that sense? I'm just I'm
like
trying to understand.
whatever it is that makes someone well off. So we can say it's like happiness or virtue or
Okay.
and so if one world has higher average utility, total utility, and more equal distribution of utility, then it's a better world. That seems like an obvious truth. Though, sorry
Okay.
to keep singling Mr. Mingy out here, but so he says, well then I think it raises a good point. Well, the normative ethics should just be guessing random moral principles and then seeing if after the fact they seem obviously correct. This would count as a type of reason. And so if you say that self-evidence is just about whether we would maintain our beliefs after we already accept them, then we should just randomly pick out moral principles and then see if we would maintain them after reflecting, rather than reasoning our way to them.
Well, I would push back a little bit with what he said. So basically, because the way that we view these things evolve over time. And so I think normative ethics still plays a part in our world because, for example, in this country, like 60 years ago, we had Jim Crow laws, right? Like black people couldn't vote and they didn't have the same rights. So like, even though we had the moral framework of the Constitution and of the Declaration of Independence, we weren't living up to those standards. And so we had to call that out and say, hey, these standards that we say that we have, we're not actually living up to them, and we should do that. And so I think that moral ethics and different things like that, normative ethics, that still plays a part because we're still falling short of those ethics today. Like, I think we still have tons of moral issues in this country. And even though we have a great framework and it's built on Christianity, which I think is the correct way to view the world, we still have a lot of work to do. And I think that's where normative ethics would come in. Like, we have these frameworks, but we're not operating within them properly.
I don't think that that's really addressing the critique. The critique is that if you think that morality is merely about um, uh, what we would, whether like that a truth is self-evident if and only if we hold it after reflection.
Mm-hmm.
Well, then if that's true, then we should just pick out random moral principles to defend and then see if they seem self-evident to us.
Well, I think I would disagree with that, because I think what tradition says is that we see things that have worked in the past, and then we should keep some of them, and then we can progress into the future if need be. We can change things as needed, but the reason these things are seen as moral is because we've seen them and they work. And so, yeah, you could maybe try to posit some new thing, but if it doesn't have anything that makes it stick, like if there's nothing truly self-evident about it, that's where it's actually in alignment with reality, then it would actually make the world worse rather than better.
Okay, so sure. I mean, I disagree with that. One question. So let's say that we grant that humans have moral knowledge. Okay, let's say we grant that there has to be a first cause. Why think that this first cause is perfectly morally good? Because it seems like just holding that there's some uncaused necessary cause, who, let's say, wants a great story, for example. It seems as though that's just a better account, and that allows us to explain evil or hiddenness. Like, let's imagine that. I mean, so here's just one account. Let's imagine that we have some sort of amorphous trickster deity that enjoys sort of stirring up trouble. Okay, and they're omnipotent. Sure. Well, that explains inconsistent revelation. They're like popping around as sort of like a joke, like giving a bunch of different people a bunch of different types of revelation. It explains the revelation you received. It explains why people have moral knowledge. They just think it would be fun. It explains why there's evil. It explains, let's say we say there's really good historical evidence for the resurrection. Maybe the resurrection did occur. These were just the tricksters messing around.
Okay.
And so that just seems like a much better explanation than Christianity. What would you say about that type of explanation?
I think the perfect goodness doesn't necessarily come from philosophical arguments. Maybe I'm missing that. I'm just not aware of philosophical arguments for why God is perfectly good. I think we just get that from the Bible. I think the Bible just says God is good, and that's where that comes from.
But why believe the Bible?
I believe it's historically accurate.
Okay, let's imagine that it's historically accurate. But the trickster, this trickster deity, could write the Bible, and they're guffawing up in their alternative realm. They're just laughing their heads off about how they resurrected Jesus, and these crazy atheists are coming up with all these excuses when really they are the ones who resurrected Jesus. But that doesn't mean that they're perfectly good. I mean, the fact that the Bible comes up with correct historical claims, which I would dispute, of course, but even if it does, the fact that it comes up with correct historical claims doesn't. I mean, we could imagine a fiction book that makes correct historical claims, and also claims that that the writer of the fiction book is perfectly good.
But could we?
And so, what data doesn't that not explain? Because it seems like you think evil is some evidence, and so this just seems like it's able to explain evil, and this just seems like a much better explanation. And you can't appeal to the truth of the Bible, because the Bible, on this account, is written by trickster deities who write some true things and some deceitful things.
Okay, so I guess I don't see how that would better describe the world than Christianity, because once again, we have a conscience and we have things that are right and wrong, and these trickster deities, so to speak, would be doing something morally not perfectly good.
Well, maybe the trickster deity gave us moral knowledge, or it can just be one trickster deity, because giving us moral knowledge made us, I mean, we could posit lots of reasons. Giving us moral knowledge made it um, so that we thought that the cause of the universe was a perfect God. And they find how confused we are to just be really hilarious. So as a result, they give us moral knowledge for that reason. Or there could be any of a bunch of reasons. Maybe they just they think that playing they're sort of a Loki-esque trickster deity, and they think that playing tricks on beings who have moral knowledge and who understand right from wrong is just much more fun than with sort of amortal automatons.
I guess my question would just be, why would I believe that over Christianity? I guess that would be my question.
Because it's able to explain all the data that Christianity explains, and it's also able to adequately explain inconsistent revelation, divine hiddenness, the problem of evil, and every other objection given to Christianity. It explains meager moral fruits. It explains. We can even. It allows us to grant like the miracle claims made by other religions. So it just explains all of the data. And so it explains everything Christianity does, and including your personal experience where you feel as though you were in touch with God. So it explains that perfectly, and it avoids all or nearly all the objections to Christianity. So it just seems like a much better theory.
Well, I think if we're just positing a random theory that like can get around your objections, like I think that the only reason that's the case is because people haven't been for centuries trying to explain how that doesn't work. Like the reason the problem of evil and the problem of divine hiddenness and meager moral fruits, the reason these arguments exist is because there have been for centuries people claiming that God exists and that he's perfectly good, and therefore these arguments were formed over time as objections. Like I'm just hearing this for the first time, so I haven't had time to think about why that doesn't work, but I'm sure it doesn't in some way. I would just have to think about it.
Okay, but so you currently have no argument for why that's a worse account than theism of anything.
Sure. And I think that the first person that heard an argument for God didn't immediately think of the problem of divine hiddenness. Like I just think that that's not immediately obvious right when you hear the claim.
Yeah, I think the problem of evil is sort of an obvious one, but
that's why I said divine hiddenness, though. I think that there's some problems that can immediately pop up. Like I don't think those said beings would, like, how would they create? Are they perfectly powerful too? Are they like able to create the universe and stuff too?
They're exactly like God, except rather than being omnibenevolent, they're sort of like Loki. So there's just sort of trickster deity who goes around playing tricks on people and screwing things up.
Okay. Yeah, I would just have to think about it before I could find an objection. I've never heard of this before.
Other question: do you believe in eternal conscious torment?
I don't know. I don't have a set opinion on hell. I saw your tweet about this the other day, and I really do need to study on hell and like read about it in the Bible, because I really don't know. I've been told my whole life that it's eternal because I was raised in church, but I really don't know. I don't want to, because to me the Bible says that we're going to pay an account for every word that we speak, and so I'm not going to say yes or no until I know for sure what I think. So
yeah, I think eternal conscious torment is insane, particularly if one holds that those who do not embrace Jesus will endure eternal conscious torment. So
sure.
One implausible entailment of that is that the Holocaust victims who were Jewish will suffer more at the hands of an allegedly perfect and all-loving God than at the hands of Hitler. And that seems like an implausible entailment.
Well, okay, so Romans chapter 2 talks about how people that have not heard the gospel, they will be judged based on how they respond to their conscience within this life. And so it's not a necessary condition that you hear the gospel, because like babies that are like have miscarriages, like they would go to heaven.
Clear, we're not talking about people who haven't heard the gospel. We're talking about
yes.
I guess we're talking.
These
about
are people that haven't heard the gospel.
Right. I'm currently talking about people who have heard the gospel, but who are committed Jews, for example, or committed Muslims.
Well, I also say that the Jews are just God's chosen people.
Okay. Sure. So then, I mean, do you think? I mean, uh, so like, okay. I mean, sure. So if you hold that, then I guess that makes the problem slightly smaller. But I mean, I've read the gospel.
Hmm.
I mean, I'm culturally Jewish, so I don't know. I don't know if I get a free pass there, um, uh, but I mean, it seems sort of strange to literally torture forever people merely on the basis of thought crimes, on the basis of not
You
believing.
know, I honestly, I'm not. I don't. This
Yeah,
is what I think about hell so far. Like I said, I'm not set on anything. This is how I see hell as of right now. I see it as a place where if people have heard the gospel, they choose to go there by denying God. And I'm not sure if it's eternal. I'm not sure because I even read. Have you read The Great Divorce by C.S. Lewis before?
no, I've read nothing by C.S. Lewis.
Okay, well,
I've just heard apologists quote C.S. Lewis a bunch of times, talking about how you can't recognize a straight line if you haven't seen a curved one or whatever, and other C.S. Lewis.
okay, well, I mean, I think he says a lot of great stuff. I don't know if obviously he doesn't everything he says isn't right. I know that he was a little bit misogynistic or whatever, but um, he he has this book called The Great Divorce where he basically talks about how people are in hell and then angels come and like evangelize to them while they're in hell and then they can choose to go to heaven, but they have to like leave their sin and all that behind and then they can go to heaven, and that's kind of like a purgatory type doctrine that like the Catholics would hold to. And so I think that it's not necessarily the case that if you believe in hell that it's eternal, it's torment forever. I think that the doctrine of purgatory and different things like that would probably get around that. And I'm
Yeah, sure. Look,
yeah.
I think that if you don't believe in eternal conscious torment, then the problem becomes much less difficult. I mean, I still would, object to future the problem of hell, but yeah, okay. So let's see. What are some other reasons? I think for this? Is there another argument for God that you want to present? If not, I can present another argument against.
Well, the main one I had left was just who was Jesus of Nazareth.
Oh, okay, yeah. Let's
Yeah,
talk.
we got to
Let's
talk
talk
about
about
Jesus.
this. Yeah. Um.
Who do you
So
say Jesus was?
Jesus was not real. No. Well, I mean, I think Jesus' mythicism is somewhat plausible, but I don't know. I mean, Jesus was, a guy born around the 6th century. Um, uh,
The 6th century?
or sorry, the year six.
Oh, okay. I was
Not.
like,
I think
what?
he was. Yeah, he
Okay.
was
I
born around the
was
year.
like, we got a lot of work to do if you think he
Yeah,
was
it seems
born in
like
the sixth
he
century.
was an apocalyptic preacher who developed a following and then had stories that blossomed after his death that culminated in the Gospels that were written more than a lifetime after the account, that are not very good evidence. Um, so yeah, I mean that's my view on who Jesus was. I mean, so all the evidence we have for the resurrection is copies of translations of anonymous hearsay accounts written a lifetime after the events in question took place, from unreliable testimony that isn't eyewitness. It's unclear whether it's a first person account, second person account, or third person account. Um, the, they tell wildly implausible and contradictory claims, that we would reject.
Contradictory.
Yeah.
Where do they contradict?
Yeah. So let's see. I have a list of some of the contradictions. So let's see. Okay. So the three gospels give three different versions of the last words of Jesus. Who very This is quoting some book. Forgetting the name of the book. The Resurrection: A Critical Examination of the Easter Story. So it's called.
Okay.
So what were the last words of Jesus? Three gospels give three different versions. Who buried Jesus? Matthew says it was Joseph of Arimathea. No, apparently it was the Jews and their rulers, all strangers to Jesus, according to Acts. How many women came to the tomb Easter morning? Was it one, as told in John, two, Matthew, three, Mark, or more, Luke? Did an angel cause a great earthquake that rolled back the stone in front of the tomb? Yes, according to Matthew. The other gospels are silent on this extraordinary detail. Who did the women see at the tomb? One person, Matthew and Mark, or two, Luke and John? Was the tomb already open when they got there? Matthew says no, the other three say yes. Did the women tell the disciples? Matthew and Luke made clear they did so immediately. But Mark says, quote, trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. And that's where the book ends, which makes it a mystery how Mark thinks that the resurrection story ever got out. Didn't Mary Magdalene cry at the tomb? That makes sense. The tomb was empty and Jesus' body was gone. At least that's the story according to John. But wait a minute. In Matthew's account, the women were filled with joy, etc. There are more of these. But and on top of the contradictory claims, there are a variety of wildly implausible and just downright bizarre claims that are made. So, I mean, the talk of, was it the Gospel of John that talks about this vast darkness embracing the land, a fact that other sources were strangely silent on. In John, there's some quote where like the Jews like take collective responsibility for everything and like say that they're, which seems to follow the growing anti-Semitism of the time. Jesus strangely condemning hand washing, and I think the book of Matthew and the book of Luke, maybe if I'm remembering correctly, where he says that all foods are clean and doubles down on the disciples not washing their hands before they eat. So, I mean, this just seems like remarkably poor evidence that we wouldn't accept in any other context.
Okay. So I guess I would like to start with a recent book that I just read, and I recommend reading it. By the way, could you tell me what book that is? Like, DM it to me on Twitter. I would like to read that.
Yeah, sure.
So yeah, this book, it's called Person of Interest by J. Warner Wallace. I just finished reading it. Have you read it before?
I've not read J. Warner Wallace.
All right, so basically, I'll give you a rundown of who he was. He was like
I'm familiar with the backstory of J. Warner Wallace, about how he was like a detective who started investigating the case around Jesus and then became Christ.
Yeah, and I thought it was really interesting. He explains it a little bit in this book too. And he talks about how he wanted to find out if Jesus was the Messiah without looking in the Bible. And so essentially the whole idea was he looked at history and looked at the things that happened around the time of Jesus, and he wanted to see if Jesus was God. And if there was a God that was real, who was trying to communicate with us, would Jesus of Nazareth fit that description? That was basically the idea. And so the first thing he did was he did an analysis of every religion on the face of the planet at the time that Jesus showed up. And he read all the different myths and all the different religions. I don't know how the heck he did that and how long that took, but then he found 15 characteristics that people who were thinking of God, they would when they were thinking of God, these were the traits that they would think of. And some of them were like inevitable or imperial or inexplicable, immortal, different things like this. And basically, he then did a list of, okay, which deities are, what characteristics do each deity have? And he went down the list, and then Jesus was the only one who had all 15 characteristics. And he thought this was really strange because he was an atheist. And he's like, that's really weird, because that means that if it doesn't matter what religion you believed in at the time that Jesus came, you would recognize him as a God-like figure. And I just think that's surprising if he wasn't God. And then, but that's not the only thing that he found out. So then he did a red zone, and I have this in my notes here. Yeah, so he did something that's called a red zone. And so essentially he had a timeline. So let's just say my finger is the timeline. And so he would make a little red zone of different things. So the first one was the spiritual zone. So this is where all the religions on the face of the planet would recognize Jesus. And this was between 350 BC and 250 BC, or 250 CE, sorry. So that's a pretty big span of time. That's like 500 years. And so then he put that down on the timeline, and then he put on top of that a different one, and then a different one, and a different one. And then it got down to a really specific span of time. So the second one was the cultural zone, which Rome at the time had conquered most of the known world. They adopted the Greek language as their main language, which would explain why the Gospels are in Greek, instituted a mailing road system where people have they could circulate letters. So basically, Rome had conquered all the known world. They made roads all over the place. They created a postal system. So this was the first time in history where most of the known world could read something in a specific language, and they also were religiously tolerant at the time because Augustus initiated Pax Romana, which was a 200-year period where Rome would not persecute you if you believed in other religions. And so we have a time period where Rome was religiously tolerant. They had a mailing system. They had conquered most of the known world. And on top of that, every single religion in the world would recognize Jesus as deity. And then he added one more red zone on top of this, which was Daniel's prophecy in the book of Daniel. And basically, Daniel said that the Messiah would show up after an edict to rebuild Jerusalem, and then before the eventual destruction of Jerusalem, which the edict to rebuild Jerusalem happened in 444 BC, and the eventual destruction of Jerusalem happened in 70 CE. And so essentially, what happens was if you put all these red zones on top of each other, you get a red zone, is what he called it, between 29 BC and 70 BC, or 70 CE, sorry. So Jesus had about, 100 years to show up, essentially, on the planet between 29 BC and 70 CE. And so he's saying basically, if there is a God and he wanted to communicate with the whole world, when would he show up? And it would be during Rome, when he had the most of the known world. And a lot of people, they try to contradict this by saying, what about now with social media? But a lot of places aren't allowed to see certain things, like North Korea and stuff like that. So it wouldn't work today, even though we have social media. But Rome could communicate to the entire known world, and they had conquered most of the known world. So if there was a God and he was trying to communicate with the entire known world, have letters go out and distributed everywhere, and it was in the exact timeline where Daniel had said the Messiah would show up, it would be during this time. And it just so happens that Jesus shows up during that time. And so I think you look at the thing before that where Jesus has all 15 traits of any God on the face of the planet during that time. You look at this red zone where he had to come within a 100-year period, and he did. Then you look at art, and you look at the fact that more books have been written about Jesus than any person in history. More paintings have been painted of Jesus than any person in history. More statues have been made of Jesus than any person in history. The most sold book in history is the Bible. The most watched movie of all time is a story about Jesus. There have been more songs written about Jesus from the top 100 artists of every single time period than Jesus. If you destroyed every Bible on the planet, you could reconstruct the gospel stories from art from any period. So like, let's say I just went to the Romantic era, and I took paintings from the Romantic era. I could reconstruct the entire gospels just from looking at paintings. And I think under atheism, all of these things are really surprising, that Jesus showed up at the perfect time. It doesn't matter what religion you believed in, you would recognize him as God. And then thirdly, he has had such an impact on culture and art, and the United States and England and all these different places who have built amazing societies were built off of this one man. And I just think it's incredibly surprising that if Christianity is false, the most influential person that ever lived, and it's not even close, is Jesus. And on top of that, every religion that has come out since Christianity's origin has incorporated Jesus in some way. Let me explain. In Islam, Jesus is considered a prophet. They don't believe he's God, but he's a prophet. Hinduism, which was around before Christianity, they now look to him as a moral teacher. Buddhists are the same way. They look to him as someone who was reaching enlightenment or whatever. You look at all these religions that are all over the world, and they look up to Jesus. I can't name any other religion where that's the case, where they look to other people's deities as a moral teacher. New Age people look to Jesus. Like, you could just keep going down the list and recognize. I think there's even like this pagan religion where they say like, they talk about density or something like that, and they look to Jesus as like the fourth density, which is like all about love and stuff like this. So all these different religions incorporate Jesus into them. And I think you take all these things together, and it's just incredibly surprising if for a man who, as you said, he came from nowhere, he lived and preached, and he was like what was the word you used, like a existential teacher about the end of the world or whatever, and
I said he
he
was an apocalyptic prophet.
apocalyptic prophet, that's the word you use. So I think it's just incredibly surprising for a man who just grew up in the middle of nowhere, walked around in the desert preaching for like 3 years, and then was killed, were to have that big of an impact on the world if he's not special in some way. And I go back to this argument posited by C.S. Lewis, where he says like God was either a liar, a lunatic, or he was Lord. And
Well, but
like
I like the fourth L option, which is legend.
legend, okay, you could argue that, but I just don't think a fake person would have that kind of impact on the world. I don't see, like, Thor doesn't do that, or Captain America doesn't do that. Like, I just don't see a world where like a fake
Well, no.
person
Just to
would
be
do that.
clear, when I say legend, I don't mean Jesus didn't actually exist. I think Jesus likely did exist. My claim is just that, um, he started out as a guy sort of similar to many other leaders throughout history, but because of the fertile religious landscape that you described for expansion, that made it so that he was really in the right place at the right time, and so it made it so that his modest claims could get embellished over time. And what we know is that over time the Gospels' claims get more and more extravagant, and so it's reasonable to assume that the facts about Jesus were the most sort of bare bones, and then they got more and more and more extravagant over time. And I think we have good evidence that, like for example, the empty tomb was false. Um, but I mean, any
From where? I don't know if we have good
well,
evidence for that.
well, we can talk about some of the evidence, but I mean, if it weren't false, we would expect it to be reported by Paul or to have the early Christians report it, which we have no evidence of. And so it seems like it was a creation by Mark. But
well, 1 Corinthians 15 was written, and it stated back to the 30s, which is not, it's before Mark. It's like the late 30s BC or CE. And
sorry, what passage are you referring?
1 Corinthians 15. And in 1 Corinthians 15, it says that Jesus died and rose again, and that he's Lord. Like, it has high Christology within that.
Yeah, sure, but it doesn't
passage.
mention the empty tomb there.
Oh, well, I wasn't talking about the empty tomb. I was just, you were saying that like
if there
claims,
were evidence of an empty tomb, we would expect it to have been mentioned by Paul, given that it would have been a pretty good apologetic defense. And so
I mean,
like Paul,
I just feel like he was probably saying what he saw and what God was revealing to him through the Spirit. But to go back to what I was saying though about 1 Corinthians 15, a lot of people say like high Christology, like you said, the claims of the gospel got more extravagant. And I would agree with that. John is the most theologically deep gospel, and it was the latest one. But the essential claims of the gospel, the fact that Jesus was killed, rose again, and was Lord, is in 1 Corinthians 15, which dates back to the late 30s. So
I was just talking about the empty tomb there, but
okay. I was just responding mostly to your claims about the claims getting more extravagant. So
yeah, but you agree that they get more extravagant, and so it's reasonable.
Yeah, sure. I'm willing to grant that.
Right, and we know that like such rumors can spread really, really, really quickly. I mean, there are other examples of religious claims spreading quickly with, for example, Apollonius. But so, I mean, the thing is, so you're okay. So in terms of of what you pointed out with the prophecies, well, I mean, I think that you can't just point to one prophecy when there are so many. When there are so many failed prophecies. So you can't just point to one when there are like so many prophecies that tell generally ambiguous things and are false. So for example, so the Bible predicts that the Messiah will build the third temple in Ezekiel 37, 26 through 28, gather all the Jews back to the land of Israel in Isaiah 4:43, 5 through 6, usher in an era of world peace, end all hatred, oppression, suffering, and disease. It says, "Great nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall man learn war anymore." That's Isaiah 2:4. Spread universal knowledge of the God of Israel, which will unite humanity as one. As it says, quote, "God will be king over all the world, and on that day God will be one, and his name will be spread," in Zechariah 14:9. So, yeah, I mean, I think, and then there are more in the New Testament that turn out not to be
But some
true.
of those are end times prophecies, like talking about the return of Jesus. They're not talking about while he was on the earth. So I think we really
The
have
Old
to.
Testament prophecies don't talk about, none of them talk about the
No,
Messiah
no,
coming
they
back,
do.
coming and then returning. No, wait, which Old
Well,
Testament prophecies talk about
well, I'm not.
the Messiah return? There's a reason why that wasn't believed by the early Jews.
Well, let me make sure I'm making my claim. I didn't realize what you were saying before I said yes, it does. I was more so saying that there are Old Testament passages that are talking about the end of days. So they didn't know necessarily that the Messiah was going to rise again, but they're talking about the end times, and you can tell by the rest of the passages around those verses. So like when you look at, I don't know, for example, the one where it says that he's going to unite the world and bring world peace, that is can be directly related to other passages in Revelation that mirror those different things. That's talking about when he returns. And so I think that when we're talking about prophecies, we have to be very careful to make sure we're talking about while he was here the first time or when he returns. And I think that when we do that, we'll see that they're not actually, like, they weren't actually wrong, that a lot of those you mentioned were just talking about the end times and not talking about the first century.
Okay, but there's no reference in the Old Testament to the end times being distinct from when the Messiah comes. So you would never get the impression that the Messiah would die and then return in the Old Testament. But I mean, there are and I think that not all the many of these examples weren't talking about the end times, but there are more where of just failed biblical prophecies. So, for example, John 14:13-14 said in that Jesus well, actually, that's a bad example. Jesus erred in predicting the amount of time he would be in the tomb. So Matthew 12:40 says, "For as Jonas was in 3 days and 3 nights in the whale's belly, so shall the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth." Mark 14:42-45 shows that Jesus died on a Friday afternoon. But Mark 16:9 and Matthew 28:1 tell us he left the tomb on Saturday night or Sunday. And so he didn't spend 3 nights in the tomb. So Jesus was wrong about that. What do you think about that example of Jesus, of a failed prophecy from the New Testament?
Well, I think that first of all, Jesus was speaking figuratively, talking about Jonah. I mean, I don't know if I would
He
have to
said he
look
would
through the
spend three
passages.
days in the whale's belly.
That's how the story goes. Yeah.
Yeah, he says that he would spend 3 nights in the heart of the earth, but but he didn't. And I mean, it's always possible to tell just so story, but the point is, you can't really use prophecies as good evidence when most of them turn out to be false.
I wouldn't say most of them turn out to be false. I think he fulfilled over 300. And also there are some that are just unbelievable that it would happen if atheism is true. Like one of them, for example, is the fact that it says his death would cause people to worship him all over the world.
Wait, what book says that?
I believe it's Isaiah 42 or 43. I'm forgetting.
When was that written?
I'm not sure. Let me look. Ugh. And then there's another, while I'm looking this up, there's another prophecy in Psalms where David talks about the Messiah dying with his arms spread out and people mocking him. And crucifixion hadn't even been invented yet. And we date this back to, like, I
Wait,
believe,
so
if I'm,
I'm not familiar. I'm not a prophecy expert, so I think I'm really not very well informed about many of the prophecies that he allegedly fulfilled. what I've heard is that many of those were forgeries written later by the later Christians to demonstrate great prophetic skill. And that seems like that would just generally be, I mean, given my priors, that would just be a better explanation than theism. Particularly when we know that at least 80% of Christian documents were forged. So, 80% of gospels are non-canonical. And so we know that there was just tons of nonsense that was being said. And so just our prior in any individual claim being accurate should be pretty low.
I think that's a very strong claim that 80% of the gospels are not canonical and they're forged. Where's your evidence for that?
Well, if you just look at, like, are you familiar with like the Gospel of Judas, for example, and the Gospel of the infancy Gospel of Thomas? There are a bunch of examples of these Gospels. The Gospel of Peter, and if you look,
so you're not talking about the ones that are in the Bible. You're speaking about things that were written that were forgeries.
Yeah.
So
the point of this is to just show that there were lots and lots of forgeries that were written, which shows that our.
But would that not be expected if they knew he was about to make a big impact on the world? Like, for example, let's give one example that is more recent, like Elvis Presley, for example. Like, when he died, there was tons of rumors about what happened to him and was he really dead, and there was all kinds of fantastical stories written about him and went in the news, and people have written books that are just totally false. They pretended to know him, and it's like, yeah, he was a legendary rock star that made a big impact. So in the same way, at the time, Jesus would have been like Elvis Presley, like this, the talk of the town.
I don't deny that Jesus was a legendary rock star that made a big impact. I just don't think that Jesus was divine. So Jesus having, but my point wasn't to make a claim about the influence of Jesus. My point in that regard was rather limited. The point was merely that the point was just that many of the claims made by early Christians, we have lots of forgeries and lots of things that are false, and so as a result, just our credence in any particular claim being true should be relatively low. But
I guess I would just say that if he really was the Son of God and he died and he made the impact that he did on the earth, like I mentioned earlier, talking about like the impact he's had on art and the impact he's had on the world and the impact that he's impacted more in the world than any other person that's ever lived, and it's not even close.
But Muhammad I would expect there to be
forgeries. I would expect there to be people writing false things. And that's why the church took, I believe, centuries to decide what would be canon, because they were going through and making sure that, what was in there was correct and that it was, theologically sound.
Sure. So, okay. So I agree that explains why there are forgeries. But if there are lots of forgeries, then it means our confidence in any individual claim shouldn't be too high. But there are many more contradictions that we could talk about. So Matthew 16:28, Jesus says,
wait. I have to go back to one thing you just said. Just because there are lots of false claims doesn't mean that there are true claims, or that they're not true claims. I think that we can say like, those are
right. I would agree with you on that. But it would mean that any individual claim, we can't have that much confidence that the claim is true.
Not necessarily. Like,
I mean,
we know what claims about.
If you know that there are many well-documented cases of there being forged information about Elvis that were written after the fact, and you know that 80% of books that were written about Elvis were false and were lies, then your confidence in any individual claim, if a person claimed that they predicted Elvis's death, and how exactly he would die before it happened, well, then you should believe it's probably a forgery. I think the same is true here, particularly if their story involves like alien abduction and other wildly implausible claims and contradicts other well-known accounts of Elvis's life.
I mean, I just think the people around him were able to create accurate stories and write accurate books. And in the same way, like we mentioned 1 Corinthians 15 that dates back to the late 30s, and the other gospel accounts, which I think Mark is the earliest. It was written in like the 50s or something like that. I think that these are not so far off that they could be accurate, especially the one that came out in the late 30s. Like that's within 5 years. Like that's nothing. And it has high Christology in that passage. So I think that when we consider those people were close to him and closer to him than those people like the Gospel of Peter and all that stuff that was written later that were clearly forgeries because they had like contradictions and they had like heresies in them, like Gnostic type heresies. I don't know. I think they were identified as heretical and non-canon because they had heresies in them, and that's how they identified them as false, because they claim things like you need special knowledge in order to come to Jesus, which is like Gnostic dualism. So that's just not true. So I think that's how they identified them. But
So-
I want to get to one last argument for Jesus. I saved it for the end. We've talked about this before on Twitter, but I'll just bring up the 5 points, the 5 facts: the death by crucifixion, the ladies found the tomb empty, independent appearances of Jesus alive, the apostles endured violence claiming that Jesus died, and then Paul and James converted to Christianity after they claimed to see the risen Jesus. And so we've got all this evidence that I mentioned earlier about Jesus fits all categories of gods, no matter what religion you believe in, any time in history. We've got his super slim margin that if the Old Testament was true and all the other cultural things I mentioned in Rome was true, Jesus had to show up within a 100-year period. If you look at the impact that he's had on art and the impact he's had on the world, and then you look at the claims that he made, and then you look at these 5 independent facts, I think it's hard to argue that the best explanation is not that he really was who he said he was and rose again. And what would you say about that?
Well, I mean, I don't think so. I think so. Sorry, go through what the core facts are.
Sure. Number 1 is death by crucifixion.
Okay, I think that's likely true.
Okay. Number 2, ladies found the empty tomb. I know you disagree with that one, right?
Yeah. I mean, so let's talk about some of the evidence against the empty tomb.
Sure.
Let me find my notes on this. So most Christian sources are made up, even according to Christians. So the probability of Mark having made up the empty tomb is decently high, just in terms of priors. Paul and earlier Christian sources at no point mentioned it. We can track we can look at the record, and it shows clearly that the claims about the empty tomb get more and more incendiary over time. So that's sort of what we would expect. There are no records of early Christians believing in an empty tomb or being accused of grave robbery, which is strange. That's what we would expect. Because if the Romans saw an empty tomb, they would assume there was grave robbery or some shenanigans going on. And as Carrier notes, quote, worse than that, the Romans would have had an even more urgent worry than body snatching. The Christians were supposedly preaching that Jesus had escaped his execution, was seen rallying his followers, and then disappeared. Pilate and the Sanhedrin would not likely believe claims of his resurrection or ascension. There's no evidence that they did. But if the tomb was empty and Christ's followers were reporting that he had continued preaching to them was still at large, Pilate would be compelled to assume an escape had occurred, and would have had to haul every Christian in and interrogate every possible witness in a massive manhunt, for it could only be to his mind an escaped convict. And we see that the empty tomb is sort of part of a broad pattern and mark of reversal of expectation. Did the women find the tomb? The women were vulnerable, and so Carrier argues, I think, persuasively that there are lots of reversals of expectations in the Gospel of Mark. So this is exactly what we would expect.
Yeah, but it's in Luke as well.
Right, the claims of the empty tomb, but Luke was based on Mark.
Do you have evidence for that?
Well,
I think Luke's account a lot of historians think that Luke had a very accurate account. Actually, I think there's even an atheist New Testament scholar, I forget his name. I wish I knew his name off the top of my head, but he said that he thinks Luke is one of the best historians that ever lived because his description of like the area, like every time he would say this is where we are, he would give like exact like descriptions of where he was. And so that historian is like, he's like, I don't know if he was an eyewitness, but he was definitely there. He definitely knows the area at the very least. And so I think that Luke is not necessarily based on Mark because it has much more detail that would make you think that he at the very least knows the areas that they were at.
Yeah, I would dispute the notion that Luke is a good historian, but
on what grounds?
Let's see. I remember I read an article a while ago about this, and I don't remember the details. So I don't have any particularly interesting commentary about it. But I think that I mean historians are pretty divided on this. But
historians are also influenced by their priors. And in this book that I'm reading on the resurrection of Jesus, it talks about that. It says that historians are just as open and like, I guess, susceptible to bias than anyone else. So I guess the perfect example of this is like miracle claims, right? So like if you believe miracles aren't possible, whenever a miracle claim happens, you're going to believe any other explanation other than the miracle claim itself. While someone else who believes miracles are possible, when a miracle claim happens, if they think there's sufficient evidence to believe it happened, they will believe it. And so I think that in the same way, when we're looking at history, different historians will view the same data and come to different conclusions based on their priors. And so, just because historians have a consensus on something, consensus doesn't make something true. You could argue it makes it more likely to be true, but it doesn't necessarily make it true.
Yeah, sure. So, yeah. So I okay. So, yeah, I'm not sufficiently informed on the topic of whether Luke was a good historian to debate the issue in any detail. I remember I remember a while ago I read about whether some evidence that seemed decently persuasive that he was not a good historian. But okay, sure, we can grant for now that Luke was a good historian. But I mean, we have examples of so-called good historians saying false things, saying very false things. So
that's fine.
And so the fact that Luke was a good historian isn't great evidence. But I mean, I think we should take stock. I mean, Luke was written more than a lifetime after the accounts that took place in question. It was relying on sources like Mark, and all the Gospels tell contradictory, wildly implausible claims about the world. And so I mean I rattled off the list of contradictions before, but so I think that just we don't have good evidence for.
Well, I don't. I also don't think that every Christian would. I don't think every Christian would argue that the Bible necessarily has to be inerrant. I think that, like, even if you see contradictions or supposed contradictions, I think that some theists would just say, okay, that's fine. If Jesus was a real person and we have good evidence to believe he rose again, and we have good evidence to believe that he's the Messiah, we don't even have to look in the Bible. Like J. Warner Wallace didn't even look in the Bible, and he decided, wow, this guy clearly impacted the world more than any person in history, and he claimed to be God, so I believe him. And so like you can even look completely outside the Bible and just be like, hey, this Jesus guy clearly was special. There was something about him that doesn't seem to be normal. He never fought in a war. He never led a country. He never did any of the things that most influential people do. He never wrote a book. And we remember him forever, and he's the most influential person that ever lived. And so even if you look outside the Bible and then you look at the arguments we discussed earlier for theism and you just put it all together, I think it makes sense that it's like, okay, I think this guy plausibly could be telling the truth. And if you go based on that liar, lunatic, or lord, I think it, or like you said, legend. I don't think a legend would have that kind of impact on the world. I don't think a liar would have that kind of impact on the world. And I don't think he was crazy. And so I believe him.
Well,
And
but there are
yeah.
lots of rapidly spreading legends. I mean, presumably, I mean, we could do a similar thing with like Buddha, right? Or um, uh, Muhammad. Well, for Muhammad, I think the lunatic explanation is decent.
Oh
But
yeah, he
um,
was crazy. I think, but the thing for Buddha though, let's talk about Buddha. If someone paints like a picture of Buddha, no matter where it is in the world, he looks almost the same, right? But if you look at paintings of Jesus all over the world, they paint him to look like their people, which I think you might think, well, that doesn't mean anything, but to me it does. I think when the Bible says that we're made in the image of God, I think that that deeply resonates with people, and I think that when people paint Jesus, they approach it differently than when they paint any other person. Like if someone here in America painted Buddha, they would paint him just like they do in China, just like they do in Japan, just like they do anywhere else. If you look at paintings of Jesus from Africa, they are like, he is black and he's wearing traditional African clothes. If you look at pictures of Jesus in China, he's wearing Chinese traditional clothes and he looks Chinese, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that
but that
Jesus is
seems
approached
explainable
differently.
because we just know more facts about what Jesus actually looked like. Um, or sorry, about what the Buddha actually looked like. And so if we have like original paintings of the Buddha, then um, uh, sort of unsurprising that it would look like it. But also, I
Well, I
mean,
mean, well, we know Jesus was from the Middle East, so he plausibly was dark skin, black hair, brown eyes. Like, like we could very plausibly just assume that's what he looked like, and probably had a beard, probably had long hair. Um, and
yeah, I mean, all the drawings of Muhammad. Oh wait, they're not drawings of Muhammad. Um, uh, but I don't know. I mean, that seems like incredibly weak evidence. That seems like just appealing to sort of contingent sociological facts about the people who around the world who have drawn Jesus, which seems I don't know. I mean, I don't know. Like that's I mean, maybe this will just come down to our intuitions here. That seems like extraordinarily weak evidence.
I mean, I'm not saying that's evidence that Jesus is Lord. I'm pairing this with like a cumulative case. Like if we were to just kind of recap everything
Sure.
we
Okay.
talked
Maybe
about.
that's a little bit of evidence as
Yeah,
part of the
like
cumulative
if I
case.
start with like my arguments from contingency, and I also forgot to mention arguments from consciousness, because consciousness is entailed in theism, and in atheism it's not. It's actually
Yeah,
surprising. So
I think consciousness is good evidence for theism. Um,
so
I'd say it like multiplies my credence in theism by quite a lot, actually, maybe 100-fold.
well, I'm glad I
Facts
mentioned
about
it then.
consciousness. Yeah, but so
Uh,
it moves me from like 1 in 1,000,000 to like
1,000.
1 in 40,000 or something.
Hey man, as long as it's moving you over. But I guess for me, what I'm trying to say is, if I look at a cumulative case for God, if I look at personal experience, if I look at arguments from consciousness, arguments from contingency, the Kalam cosmological argument, the moral argument posited by C.S. Lewis and William Lane Craig, if I look at, we talked about one other argument, the ontological argument, I think if it's possible that God exists, it logically follows he does exist. And then we look at the historical evidence for Jesus and how he's impacted the world and how he came at the perfect time that he was prophesied to, and at the perfect time to communicate with the whole world. And then we look at those five independent facts, and the best explanation is that, he did. We should believe him. He doesn't seem like he was crazy. He doesn't seem like he was lying. I don't think a legend would make that kind of an impact on the world. And then on top of that, you look at the way he's impacted art and music and movies. And the most sold book of all time is the Bible. The most watched movie of all time is a book or a story about Jesus's life. You look at in the top artists that have ever made music ever, they've all written a song about Jesus. They haven't made songs about Buddha. They haven't made songs about Muhammad. They haven't made songs about other people, but they've all made songs about Jesus. And so it's like, I don't think that alone stands as evidence that there's a God and that Christianity is true. But I think when you start to look at all these things together, I think it serves as a really strong cumulative case for Christianity.
Yeah. So I mean, I think that. Well, so I think the moral argument is precisely zero evidence. I mean, I guess maybe it's some higher order evidence. I think the ontological argument is zero evidence. I think the qualm is very weak evidence. I think consciousness is good evidence, but I think it's dwarfed by order of magnitude by the problem of evil. But I mean, you know how capturing Christianity had as 150 plus arguments against God. So I have 228 arguments against God. And I think many of those actually like significantly decrease my credence. And so theism is just getting completely buried, I think, in the evidential assessment. But I mean, I think if we just plug facts about evil into a Bayes sheet, it'll come out, and I've done this, and so it'll come out as theism being much more evidentially powerful than or rather atheism being much more evidentially powerful than theism. But I mean, I
was going to
like,
let you finish that sentence. I was going to let you say theism is more explanatorily powerful.
Yeah.
I was like, yeah. I was like, yes, keep going.
Yeah. But, hey, wait. Okay, this might be interesting actually. I'll share my screen and let's see, Google Slides, or not slides, spreadsheet. Okay. And let's actually just compare like how we weight the evidence for theism versus atheism, because
Sure.
no, I mean actually there are like too many factors. This would go on for hours. Let's not do this because they're just too
Maybe
many
another
factors.
time. Maybe another. We'll do another one.
But I did this at one point, and I didn't get through all the factors. I compared all the evidence for theism, and then I just did sort of the cumulative case appealing to all the facts about evil. And then I was at like a quadrillion to one or something, and I hadn't even gotten to most of the arguments for atheism. No, I think that the higher order considerations about evil sort of plausibly was that. But anyways, so
you think evil like basically completely negates theism by itself?
yes, no, I mean, it's not just one fact about evil. It's just the theism predicts that the world was designed by a perfect God. A perfect designer, you would expect a perfect design, a design that couldn't be improved upon. And yet there are billions of ways to improve upon the design. And there's no adequate account of why we can't
I don't know if that follows though. I don't think it follows that a perfectly good being makes perfect creation, because then we'd be like him. We'd be perfect. I just don't think that follows.
In terms of creating the natural world, they would make perfect natural.
I think the natural world's pretty cool. I mean, there's definitely mistakes, but I mean, I think that if you look at the natural world, like the way that the ecosystem works and the way that rain allows us to have like an unlimited source of water, and we have like carbon dioxide into the leaves, and the leaves breathe out oxygen, and all of our food sources have carbs, fat, and protein, and that's exactly what we need to eat. And we have eyes to help us see and ears to help us hear, and all of our senses. Like, I just think there's so many things if you look at nature that it's just, I think it took an incredible amount of intelligence.
But I think if you look at nature, there's more misery than happiness in nature as well.
Well, I mean,
very surprising on theism.
I mean, I don't know. Like I said, I think that theism explicitly says that there will be suffering in the world, and I think that also.
But why would there be more suffering than happiness for moral patients rather than moral agents? Theism certainly doesn't predict that the majority of suffering in the world would be dominated by moral patients, and that they would suffer more than they experience well-being.
But the thing is, if you go to heaven, you will experience perfect goodness forever.
Do animals go to heaven?
I don't see why not.
Okay, if animals go to heaven, but again, that still doesn't explain why there's all this suffering on Earth. I mean, if I claimed
God said so.
Well, if I claimed that there is that I'm the world's greatest architect, and I build a house for you, and the house is falling apart, the rooms are collapsing. There's like feces on the wall. Like there's like asbestos, which poisons to death 19,000 children just randomly. Like it's just a disaster. But then I'm like, wait. This doesn't jeopardize the claim that I'm the greatest possible architect. Because It doesn't jeopardize that claim because I'm going to build another house 100 years from now, and that'll be a perfect house. And that house will let in some of the people who are harmed by this house. Well, you still wouldn't believe the claim that I'm the best architect because even though infinite compensation is pretty nice, it's still not an explanation for why you created the crappy house in the first place.
I just don't think that's analogous because in order to be the best architecture, that entails that you build the best houses. But to me, like I said earlier, just because God is a perfect being, that doesn't follow that he makes a perfect world. In fact, you could argue that he did and that Adam and Eve messed it up. Like you can't even argue he did make a world and then it was fallen.
Well, but I think one, I mean, we went over this. The Garden of Eden was both not a perfect world, and even if the Garden of Eden were a perfect world, there's no explanation of why God would make the consequence of eating from the tree of the fruit of knowledge of good and evil be completely screwing up that perfect world.
I mean, there's so many ways to talk about this because I also think that the story of Adam and Eve is allegorical. I don't necessarily think it's literal, but like, I just think that it is a story that's full of truth and that it explains things about human nature. I don't think that necessarily there was a Garden of Eden and that they actually ate from a fruit. I think that it's more so like humans, like the human, or if we accept evolution and we just say the first humans were the first Homo sapiens that bear the image of God, like he chose humans within Homo sapiens that bear the image of God. I know a lot of theists that hold that view. It would just be that they became conscious. Like they, at first, before that moment, they weren't conscious. And so they had no awareness of good and evil. They were just part of nature, just like animals are. And then the first humans became conscious. And so a lot of people think that the story of Adam and Eve is just the allegorical story format version of humans becoming conscious for the first time.
Wait, you think that humans were that pre-humans there was not consciousness?
I don't think under evolution you could argue that consciousness always existed. I think that it would have to come later during like
well, I didn't say always existed, but if you look at what's going on in the human brain, it's conscious. You see the same things in other animals, which is why the overwhelming scientific evidence that animals are conscious.
Yeah, but I guess
I think. Wait, so you think that like the dinosaurs weren't conscious?
I don't think they're conscious in the same way that humans are.
But do you think they were conscious at all?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right, so
like
then you have
they're like sentient.
But then the fall can't explain it because there was.
I would say they're sentient, but not conscious. Let me reiterate. I would say they're sentient.
What do you mean?
But they're not conscious. Like they can move around on their own. Huh?
Okay, but do you think that there's something that it was like to be a dinosaur? That they like had experiences.
I think they have
felt pain, for example.
I think they could feel pain. They could have, but I wouldn't say that they have consciousness in the same way that humans do. I would say we have a unique form of consciousness.
Did they have mental states?
Sure. That's fine.
Okay, right. So
but
then
I just
you have
don't
the difficult task of explaining why animals had painful mental states for billions of years before humans were ever on the scene. Or yeah.
I mean, like I said, I think that the Bible explicitly says the world will have suffering and evil.
But why? But you chalk that up to the fall. But then that can't explain evil that was going on for billions of years before the fall, or hundreds of millions. I don't know the exact time scale.
I mean. Well, once again, though, if we're looking at the story allegorically, it's just the idea that humans became conscious. So, like, a lot of theists hold to that view that, like, the story of Adam and Eve is just humans gaining consciousness and suddenly realizing that they were naked. Like, that is the idea of, like, oh my gosh, we're vulnerable. We could die. We good and evil exists, and we have a conscience, and like we. As Aristotle put it, we're the political animal. Like we're different than the other animals. Like other animals don't form societies. They don't go to universities. They don't have discussions like this. I just, humans are unique and they're different and they're special. And so I would say that animals are sentient and they do have experiences, but they do not have consciousness in the same way that people do. And so I would say that consciousness allowed them to become aware of their suffering rather than suffering never existed before that. I would say it probably always existed. It was just that they became aware of that suffering. And I think that falls perfectly fine if you view Adam and Eve, that story as an allegorical story. I think I lean more towards the fact that Genesis 1 through 11 are not literal stories. I would hold that history begins with Abraham in Genesis 12.
Yeah.
John
So
Buck.
okay. Yeah. Funny
Yeah,
enough.
we've been going a while.
Yeah. So but even if that's true, it can be allegorical. But then that can't explain evils that were around before humans. If you chalk it up to
I think
humans
so,
becoming
yeah, because when they're becoming conscious, then they are becoming aware of their suffering. I think animals have experiences of suffering, but they're not self-aware of it. I think, like I said, humans are self-aware and conscious in a way unique to the animal kingdom.
um,
And so I would say suffering always existed, but we are just aware of it in a unique way.
but why did God cause billions of years of suffering before humans were around? You can't blame it on humans and the fall if it was around for billions of years. And just the fact that the Bible says it isn't an explanation. I mean, God is not great. The book by Hitchens says a bunch of things, but that 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 wouldn't mean that it's like a prediction of atheism just because it's said in a book by an atheist. And so just because it's said in the Bible, that the Bible sort of retroactively says, and there will be suffering. Um, that's not a good explanation for why there's
Well,
suffering.
I mean, Christians believe in special revelation, though. So Christians would believe that if the Bible says something, it's more authoritative than if you and I were to write something.
No, I know, but you can't just say the fact that Christianity says there will be evil. That's not a theodicy. That's
Well,
just
I'm giving you the Christian perspective because you're saying evil is in contradiction with, theism, and I would just disagree. I think that the Bible specifically says there will be suffering, and I'm fine with that.
but I mean Graham Priest says that there will be um or no, I won't go with that example. I mean the the Quran also says that there will be suffering, but that
Sure.
or the I mean just the fact that that your religion asserts that there will be suffering isn't an explanation for why there will be suffering. It just involves saying that there will be suffering. And so
But if Christianity is true, then I think that it's good that it says that, don't you think? Like if
I agree,
Christianity is the
but
true
again,
religion.
but Nathan, that's not an explanation. Like it can be true that if Christianity is true and it tells accurate, then it would tell accurate claims. So then there would be suffering. But that's not
Yeah.
an explanation for why Christianity is compatible with suffering. Just pointing out that Christianity asserts that Christianity is compatible with suffering is not a reason to think that Christianity is in fact compatible with suffering.
I would disagree. I think if the Bible says something, then it is compatible with Christianity. I think that our philosophical
Okay,
ideas of like
let's
a
imagine.
perfectly good being, like we're just asserting like, oh, he's a perfectly good being, therefore that's logically incompatible with evil. But I would disagree with that. I don't think that it's
Okay,
logically incompatible.
let's imagine the Bible said something like, um, uh, and there will be squares and there will be true contradictions, but you will never find them, or something. Or no, that's a bad example. But I mean, if the Bible observes a fact and then says there will be insert fact, that's not an explanation for why there's that fact and why that fact is compatible with these.
Well, I just think that I don't know how to explain this, like, I guess in a way that would be satisfactory to what you're trying to say. But I think from the Christian perspective, if we're to say why this exists, for the Bible to say it is a good enough reason because we believe that it's special revelation, it's from God. And so we believe that when the Bible says it, it's God saying it. And so if God says there will be suffering, I'm just like, okay, you created the world. I wouldn't even be here if you didn't do that. So I'm
But
just going to accept reality as it is. And I think that from a Christian perspective, that's just how we view it. I don't think we look at it like, well, why? Why does it have to be that way? I just think we're like, okay, well, you said so, so that's just how it is.
But that's not a successful theodicy.
I mean, in your view, maybe. I think that if we look at all the evidence and all the arguments that I presented earlier, I think that it's more than convincing to get someone to Christianity. And then, like I said earlier at the very beginning of our conversation, I think that evil is not incompatible with Christianity. I think that God said that it would exist, and therefore I think that it slightly turns the dials in your favor, but I think all the arguments I presented earlier does more than enough to turn it back in my favor. And that's
Okay.
just where we would probably fundamentally disagree, because you view evil as like a quadrillion to one or whatever it was you said. So I think that's just a fundamental disagreement that we have, that I don't view evil as logically incompatible with God. I think it is perfectly fine with Christianity. I'm not even sure if we have grounds to call something evil if God doesn't exist. And you might not think that's a good argument, but I don't know. I just think if there's not a standard for goodness, I don't even know if we have grounds to say anything is evil. And
I think there is a standard for goodness. I'm a moral realist. I'm a utilitarian. So um,
well, I would just say that your morals came from God.
right. Well, okay. So actually, I mean that leads way to another interesting argument against theism, which is the argument from moral uncertainty. So you say
Okay.
God wrote the moral law on our hearts, correct?
Okay. Yeah, I would say that.
So why does the moral law written on our hearts have so many errors? Like why does the moral law written on many people's hearts involve thinking that it's okay to rape, enslave, torture other people, to do horrendous things? I mean, we know that the moral law written on our hearts is in error a huge percentage of the time, right? Given that throughout most of human history, there have been things that we currently regard as abhorrent. So, lots of people have the moral law that's written on their hearts involves saying that abortion is okay, right? But you think abortion isn't okay. And so that means that a lot of people, and so whoever's right, that means that there has to be lots of incorrect claims that are part of the moral law written on people's hearts.
I would say two things to that. Number one, I would say that it doesn't follow that objective morality exists, that everyone will know that objective
No,
morality,
no, no.
because
But remember, I agree with you about objective morality. My claim is I'm disputing
Mhm.
the claim that that we have direct access to the objective morality through God having written it on our heart.
Well, exactly. The Bible tells us, if I'm just going back to the Bible, that things of the Spirit are interpreted by the Spirit. And so I would say that people who have God, uh, they would probably view morality different than people that don't have the Spirit within them. And then I would also say people that are raised in different places, that highly affects, like in the nature versus nurture debate. I think nature sets us up. It kind of like gives us predispositions to be certain ways. And then I think nurture does the rest of the work. Um, so, for example, like my sister is more like out there, and she's more, I guess, what's the word I'm looking for? She's more like go get them, I guess. And then I'm more chill, I'm more laid back. And I think our predispositionally we're that way through nature. But then the way we were raised gives us the rest of what we have. And so I think if someone was raised on the other side of the world in the same way, they have predispositions, they're predisposed to certain things, but then the way that they're raised through those moral frameworks I mentioned earlier, whether it be autonomy or community or divinity, they're going to view the world totally different. However, that doesn't change the fact that all of those frameworks in some way represent God's morality. I think that's the key distinction here, is that uh,
Okay.
we we
Uh,
view morality through the framework of in the West of autonomy mostly, um, and so we misunderstand the moral framework of community, and because of that, we think that they're wrong. But in reality, they just understand a part of. I would just say that they understand a part of God's heart that we don't, and we've kind of
I
almost
so
idolized autonomy.
I don't think that that's a response to the argument I made. So tell me which premise you'd reject. One, if Christianity is true, God wrote the moral law in our hearts.
Okay.
You would agree with that?
Um, initially, yes. If I think about it more,
Okay.
maybe
2.
not, but I'll think about it.
If God wrote the moral law on our hearts, it would not have errors.
I think we'll probably disagree on that one.
So you think that God would write a moral law on our hearts but have it have errors? Why would he do that?
I
I mean, if
think.
God is allowing us to know right from wrong, why would he make us wrong about
Okay,
our
so
knowledge
I'm
from wrong?
all right. So let me explain what I meant by that. So I think that God has a moral law that's written on our heart. I think He wrote it. However, I think that subjectivity exists, and I think that subjectivity allows us to, have error. And I think that we're not perfect, and so we think things that are wrong, and we're ignorant of certain things, and that affects our ability to govern ourselves. And so I would say that the moral law itself is not in error. I would say that we are in error, and we are fallen, and we are ignorant, and we are not morally perfect either. We're sinful.
But the moral law written on some people's hearts tells them that they should flip the switch in the trolley problem. Other people, the moral law written on other people's hearts says that they shouldn't flip the switch. Why would God be writing a false moral law on one of their hearts about the trolley problem?
So what's the trolley? What is this?
The trolley problem is a train's coming down a track. It's going to hit 5 people, but you can flip a switch and that'll redirect the train to hit one person.
Okay. So you're saying that some people will flip it and some people will let it hit 5 people?
Some people think you should flip it, and some people think you should let it hit the 5 people.
Where would you stand on that?
I think you should flip the switch.
And let it hit one person?
Yeah, but
Okay.
but there are people who disagree. Is the point? And so
I would disagree.
yeah, right. So the question is, why would the God writes on your heart that you shouldn't flip the switch, on my heart that you should? Why would there be an inconsistency in the moral law?
Well, I think that our experiences inform kind of like, okay, we were just talking about earlier how our priors affect the way that we view data, right? And the way that I think our priors in the same way affect the way that we approach moral situations. And I don't think that's error in the law itself. I think that that's error in us.
But why would but you say that the moral law is written on our hearts. So I'm not saying that the moral law is going awry. I agree that there's a fact of the matter. What I'm saying is that you think that God allows us to know the moral law.
Yes.
Um,
Okay. Well,
correct?
let me go this way with it then.
But if we, sorry, can I just finish the point briefly? But
I was gonna say. Oh, sorry. I thought you were saying Migo.
yeah,
Sorry.
but if we could know the moral law, then there wouldn't be the things that we think we know about the moral law wouldn't have errors and wouldn't have contradictions.
So I guess I think there's a difference between ambiguous situations where the moral, what is right and wrong, isn't clear. I think it's different to say like people disagree on this ambiguous situation, therefore objective morals aren't written on our hearts. I think that the better way to show that the moral laws written on our hearts is what I mentioned earlier about the fact that there are universal right and wrongs, which include murder, theft, sexual perversity, cruelty to animals. These are things that are universal in all societies across the world through all of time. And so I would say that those are the things. And if you even look in like the 10 Commandments, these are things that are clearly written in scripture. And they've been there for thousands of years. And so I would say that there are universal right and wrongs that were written on our hearts, but that doesn't necessarily apply to situations that are ambiguous, like the trolley problem or whatever it was called.
Right. So okay. So let's say we grant there are universal rights and wrongs, but that once again, so pointing out that there are some things that we know about morality is not an explanation of why there are so many things we don't know about morality. Why we don't have direct access to what we should do in the trolley problem, for example. Wait, sorry. I'll be back in 1 second. I'm just going to go get water.
Okay. I'm going to check my phone.
You should entertain people while I'm away.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I hope you guys are enjoying this. I think we've been going for almost 4 hours now. That is crazy. So yeah, I think that my basic argument for God, as I've kind of mentioned, is just a cumulative case. I start with personal experience, go to consciousness, contingency, the kalam, cosmological arguments, moral arguments, evidence for Jesus, and then just ask, like, who was this guy? And I think if you take the evidence for God and the arguments for God, and then you take who this Jesus guy was, and you put that together, I think you get a good case for Christianity. And I don't think that Christianity is incompatible with evil, which I've said a bunch of times already in this argument or this debate. So that's my recap while you were gone.
All right. So I'm back. Okay. So, sure, but pointing. Okay. So back on the point about the moral uncertainty. So pointing out that there are some things that we know. Maybe that's best explained by theism. I mean, I think I gave a perfectly satisfactory naturalistic account of that. But even if we grant that theism is a slightly better explanation for that, well, you have no explanation. Well, so I mean, one, it seems like if you say that evil isn't evidence against God, or isn't much evidence against God, then good things wouldn't be very much evidence for God. But I think the more important point would be that you're just changing the subject. So pointing out the things that we do know doesn't address the cases where the moral law written on our hearts gets the wrong answers. And so you're just talking about something different.
I mean, I would just say that humans are fallen creatures. We have subjective, like, objectivity is only like half of the equation. There's also subjectivity, and those things, a lot of people try to put them at odds with one another. I don't really think, I think it's not that simple. I think that subjectivity is simply a soul observing the objective world around it, and people can see the same thing and come to different conclusions. And I think that when we have the moral law written on our hearts, yes, there are objective truths, but that doesn't change the fact that we can all look at the same objective fact and interpret it differently subjectively. And I think even when we look at the case of Jesus, like, we're looking at the same facts, the objective facts. Even if you disagree with the empty tomb one, like, we could get rid of that one totally and look at the other 3 or 4 that are widely accepted, and we'll interpret that totally differently because of our presuppositions. And so I would just say that subjectivity plays a big part in our inability to recognize the objective. And I think our everyday experience backs that claim up.
Sure. Okay. But that's, once again, I mean, that's still not like an explanation of why we have so much more moral uncertainty.
I don't see how, though. I think subjectivity is flawed. And I think that what we experience...
But why make our ability to tap into the moral knowledge be flawed?
Wait, what do you mean, why make it like that? I think
Like,
humans are just
so
flawed.
That we don't have infallible moral knowledge.
Well, humans just aren't perfect. That's just the
reality. But you think that God made us have moral knowledge. So why would he make the moral knowledge that we have be wrong so much? This, once again, seems best explained by the trickster hypothesis, that that the creator put a bunch of moral knowledge that we have access to, but then just like mucked it up and made us have a bunch of wrong moral intuitions.
I just don't think that we get the real universal wrongs wrong that often. I don't think people of any country or any timeline think murder's okay. I don't think people anywhere think theft is okay.
But lots of people thought slavery was okay. Throughout most of human history, there's been slavery.
And I grant that. And that's horrible.
Enormous repression of women, repression of gay people. I mean, like just societies throughout history have routinely practiced things that we currently regard to just be unfathomably evil.
Yeah, I think we do unbelievably horrible things today.
But people have right. I mean, you think that abortion is like a mass genocide that's going
Yeah,
on under our
60
noses.
million babies. Yeah, I think that 100%.
Yeah. But if you think that, right, then uh then we're not getting the important things right. We're getting the important things of not murdering people. We're getting that totally wrong. Um
But I would once again just point out that in the moral framework of autonomy, I think that abortion is a consequence of us idolizing autonomy. I think we've made autonomy the end all be all in the abortion argument. And I don't want to debate abortion on here.
yeah, no, I
Yeah,
don't
I
I
just
don't
think
have
that
very strong views about abortion. Right now
uh,
I'm just taking for granted that you were right about abortion. Right? But
I
if you
I
are
just
right about abortion, that means that people's moral intuitions are firing dramatically on a scale where they're sanctioning mass murder, where they're
but
sanctioning like 10 holocausts.
I think that would be the result of idolizing autonomy. That's my view. I think that
But
because most
why would
people
God
that
make our moral intuitions idolize autonomy in ways that lead to flawed moral judgments?
I don't think God makes us do that. I think we choose to do that.
Okay,
I think it's just easy to it's easy to flaunt our responsibilities to uh do something. It's easier to just be like, oh, I don't want to debate abortion, but it's easy to just say, oh, I had sex and I don't want to have a kid, but I'm pregnant, so I'm gonna go take care of this in an abortion clinic. It's easier to do that than to be like, okay, I messed up, but I'm still going to go through with this and be a mom now or be a parent now. So I just think that idolizing autonomy is a um, good way for me to, and we have the ability to idolize things because we have free will, and because we have free will, we can idolize things. God's not going to force us to choose him. That's not love. And if God is love, like the Bible says, then he's not going to force us to do things against our will. And so he gives us the freedom to idolize things. And because we can idolize things, then we can be wrong about morality because we're not idolizing or we're not submitting to him. And so because of that, we would be submitting to our own autonomy or whatever else.
okay. Um, but but there are lots of people who like carefully reflect on the matter, right? Who think
Sure.
really hard about what the correct moral view is, and lots of people who don't, who just consult their moral intuition. And there are
Sure.
people of both of those types, including many Christians, who end up thinking abortion is permissible. And so that shows that our moral knowledge is far from infallible, even about important things like being against murder.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think people that are for abortion don't view it as murder. And if they
Right,
did, they would be against it.
right. But right, so we don't even so our moral intuitions don't even allow us to know what things are murder in the morally relevant sense.
I mean, I would chop that up to propaganda, though.
But there are lots of philosophers who are presumably not misled by um, uh, propaganda.
I
Um,
mean, I wouldn't give philosophers that much of a pass.
well,
I
wait.
think
So
anyone,
what?
I think
What?
anyone is
I mean,
susceptible to
I think
propaganda.
abortion is like a different. I mean, I don't have much of a view on abortion. I lean towards being pro-choice, but I think at the very least, abortion is a difficult issue. There are
Oh
real.
yeah, I don't think I don't think it's cut and dry. I don't think it's an easy conversation at all, and that's why it would be a whole other stream to talk about abortion. I would be,
Yeah, no, right, right.
yeah.
So I'm not intending to talk about abortion like in the
Mhm.
object level, but I'm just talking about it as an example of where, on your view, our moral intuition seems to go really, really far astray, and it seems hard to give an account.
I just think that, like I said, people that are for abortion, they don't view it as murder, and if they did, they would be against it. That's why every single person that's pro-life does view it as murder, and that's why they think it's wrong. And so I think that it's not the moral law that's the problem; it's our subjective interpretation of what is happening within the situation. And in the same way with the trolley, let's go back to the trolley example, because um, you said that you would pull the lever, and I said I wouldn't. And the reason for that is you're a utilitarian, so you think whatever is going to have the best situation or only one person dies is the best case scenario. While someone like me would say, if I pull the lever, I'm now the reason that person died. While if I don't pull the lever, then I guess you could argue that I'm hands scot free or whatever, right? It's just a horrible situation, but like, um, so we're looking at the same facts, but we're interpreting it differently based on our subjective experience or our subjective moral views of the world. And so I would just say that that's what it chalks up to, subjectivity. And that doesn't mean that there's not a correct answer. That doesn't mean that there's not an objectively correct answer. I could be wrong on that one. I haven't really thought about it through that much. My initial intuition told me don't pull the lever. Maybe if I thought about it for an hour, I would come to a different conclusion. But my gut reaction was like, no. So I think that, and here's the thing too, is that you are a utilitarian because you've studied morality and you've studied these things, and that's the conclusion you came to. Kind of like we talked about with Aristotle earlier, things that are self-evident aren't necessarily self-evident to everyone. That's what the point of education. Education trains our intuitions and trains our ability and like kind of helps us to understand the world in a better way. And then it helps us make decisions.
Yeah, sure. Okay. I feel okay. I mean, there's certainly more to be said, that we've been going for roughly 4 hours, so this may
We
be a
have
good
been
time to
going a
wrap
long
it up.
time.
So I do feel like we unpacked like a decent part of the cumulative case for theism, and some of it for atheism. Certainly the problem of evil, though I think there's a lot more evidence for atheism, like meager moral fruits, more specific features of evil, defined hiddenness, etc. That I think would be worth talking about at some point. But
I honestly wish I prepared more for the problem of evil, because I don't think I was prepared to talk about that at all. I came in there and I was like, crap, we're talking about this for like 40 minutes. But
yeah, I mean the problem of
that is
evil is
something I
like
need to think
the
about.
biggest piece of evidence. But okay, yeah, thanks so much for coming on. Do you have any last words before we wrap up the stream? Or
Well, I mean, just thanks so much for having me.
yeah,
This was a
thanks.
fun conversation. Let's do it
Yeah,
again
thanks
sometime.
for coming on. Yeah. All right. Thanks for watching, everyone. Yeah, thanks.